For 10,000 years, humanity has bled across the stars. An empire of 1,000,000 worlds, ruled by a corpse who cannot die. The golden dream of mankind lies broken, sustained only by endless sacrifice and brutal devotion. This is how we fell from gods to slaves, and why we still fight when victory is impossible. In the forgotten hollows of history, mankind first bled upon the soil of terror. Long before the God-Emperor's light, long before the golden age of technology, there existed only the endless wars of the techno-barbarians. Savage tribes wielding half-understood relics. Amid the radioactive vastness of old Earth, the sky above ancient terror hung low and poisoned, a shroud of industrial effluence and nuclear fallout that had not seen clean sunlight in millennia. Oceans once blue now churned with chemical hate, their depths home to abominations born of mankind's arrogance. Mountains eroded not by wind and water, but by the constant percussion of artillery and the hungry mining of resources to feed the ever-turning wheels of war. This was humanity's cradle, a world already dying before its children had learned to walk among the stars. Fragmented records speak of nation-states whose names are now liturgies known only to the most dedicated scholars of the administratum. These entities warred with technologies that would later be deemed heretical. Their leaders claiming divine right through bloodlines long since purged from imperial archives. They built their empires on the backs of machines that thought like men and men who served like machines. In their hubris, they believed themselves masters of their world. The age of technology dawned slowly like a red sun over fields of slaughter. Mankind's first faltering steps beyond its atmosphere were tentative, fearful. The moon fell first to human ambition, then Mars, then the frozen reaches of Sol's outer planets. Generation ships pushed into the unknown, carrying the faithful and the desperate to distant stars. Standard template constructs, the STCs, became humanity's greatest achievement. Machines capable of instructing human colonies how to build anything from water purifiers to warships, ensuring mankind's survival among alien spheres. It was a time of unlimited potential, a time when human intellect soared unconstrained by superstition or dogma. The men of iron served their creators faithfully, artificial minds handling the machinery of civilization, while human masters plumbed the secrets of the universe. Warp travel became possible through navigator houses whose mutant third eye could perceive the currents of the Imperium. Thousands of worlds felt the tread of human boots and the galaxy trembled at the touch of human ambition. Yet all golden ages tarnish. All empires fall. The first psychers emerged without warning. Humans touched by powers beyond mortality. Their minds channels for forces that dwelt in the realm beyond reality. At first celebrated as the next evolution, these witches soon became vessels for entities hungry for mortal suffering. Entire worlds died screaming as the untrained and unprotected psychers became gateways for demons whose names would later be struck from all records by inquisitorial decree. Then came the warp storms, immaterial hurricanes that severed the shipping lanes between stars, isolating colonies from terror and from each other. Ships that dared the storms emerged centuries later. Their crews transformed or simply gone. Astropathic communications became garbled whispers or ceased entirely. The great human federation lacking central authority or connection began to fragment like a ceramic vessel dropped upon rocket. This was the age of strife, the old night. The time when humanity learned the true meaning of darkness. On countless worlds, technology became religion. As the knowledge to maintain it faded, machine cults arose, worshipping the remaining STCs, offering human sacrifice to appease machine spirits that existed only in their increasingly primitive understanding. Other worlds regressed further, forgetting the stars entirely, believing the universe extended no further than their atmosphere. Some planets died quietly as life support systems failed without maintenance. Others died violently as stored weaponry was unleashed by desperate survivors or triggered by automated systems responding to long outdated protocols. Terror itself became a battleground for techno-barbarian warlords, each claiming territory through force of arms or technological superiority. Rad zones and chemwastes marked boundaries between warring states. The once unified cradle of humanity splintered into 1,000 kingdoms, each ruled by tyranny and superstition. It was into this age of devastation that he came. The first records of the Emperor are fragmentary, contradictory, more devotional than historical. Some claim he was born of mortal parents in ancient Anatolia thousands of years before mankind reached the come stars. Others insist he was the collective reincarnation of thousands of ancient shamans who foresaw the coming of the warp predators and sacrificed themselves to create a being capable of guiding humanity. The truth is known only to the Emperor himself, and he has spoken no word since his interment upon the Golden Throne. What records remain agree on this? He possessed power beyond mortal comprehension, psychic might that could extinguish stars, an intellect that perceived patterns across millennia, and most terrible of all, the charisma to make men love him, even as he sentenced billions to death in his wars of unification. The Emperor watched from the shadows as humanity tore itself apart during the Age of Strife. His reasons for withholding his guidance during this time remain his own. Perhaps even he, with all his foresight, could not prevent the collapse. Perhaps he judged that mankind needed to experience the full depth of its own barbarism before it would accept his rule, whatever his reasons, when he finally revealed himself. It was not with compassion, but with terrible purpose. The unification wars began in the region once called Asia, where the Emperor's Thunder Warriors, proto-Astartes, created through forbidden genetic manipulation, swept across the continent with bolter and blade. Kingdom after kingdom fell before his armies. Those who surrendered were incorporated into his growing empire. Those who resisted were erased so completely that not even their names survive in the historical record. The Pacific Empire, the Indonesic bloc. These were among the greatest of terror's fractured nations. Their technologies were formidable, their armies numberless, their rulers convinced of their own immortality. All fell before the Emperor's inexorable advance. His Thunder Warriors were few compared to the hordes they faced, but each was the equal of 100 regular soldiers. They knew neither fear nor mercy, only the directive to conquer in their creator's name. The war for terror lasted centuries. Mountains were leveled. Seas boiled away. Entire populations put to the sword or worse. The Emperor's enemies deployed weapons of mass destruction, unleashed gone-crafted abominations, even attempted to bargain with warp entities. Nothing availed them. One by one, the techno-barbarian nations were absorbed into what would eventually become the Imperium of man. Victory did not bring peace. The Emperor knew that mankind's survival depended on its reunification, not just on terror, but across the stars. The scattered human colonies would need to be brought back into the fold by diplomacy when possible, by force when necessary. But first, he needed warriors worthy of such a crusade. The Thunder Warriors, for all their might, were flawed creations, unstable, prone to psychological degradation, unsuited for the grand vision the Emperor now pursued. With cold pragmatism, he ordered their systematic elimination once terror was unified. Official histories claim they died gloriously in the Battle of Mount Ararat, their purpose fulfilled. The truth, guarded jealously by the Adeptus Custodes, is far darker. The Thunder Warriors were purged by their own creator. Their genetic legacy erased to make way for superior weapons. Beneath the scarred surface of terror's Himalayas mountains, in gene laboratories hidden from all but his most trusted servants, the Emperor began his greatest work. Using his own genetic material as a template, he crafted 20 superhuman beings, the Primarchs. Each was designed to embody an aspect of his own character. Each destined to command a legion of warriors in the coming reconquest of the galaxy. The Emperor intended these Primarchs to mature under his guidance to learn the arts of war and governance directly from their creator. Fate, or perhaps entities with purposes counter to the Emperor's own, intervened. The gestating Primarchs vanished, their incubation pods scattered across the galaxy by forces that remain the subject of forbidden speculation. The Emperor's plans, meticulous as they were, required adaptation. Using the salvaged genetic material from each Primarch, the Emperor created the Space Marine Legions, 20 brotherhoods of transhuman warriors, each imprinted with the genetic legacy of their missing Primarch father. These artists were superior to the Thunder Warriors in every respect. More stable, longer-lived, capable of operating independently for extended campaigns. They would form the spearhead of the Great Crusade, the Emperor's grand design to reclaim humanity's lost empire among the stars. While the first Space Marine Legions trained for their destiny, the Emperor secured an alliance with the Mechanicum of Mars. The Red Planet had weathered the Age of Strife better than most. its tech priests preserving fragments of Dark Age technology behind defensive rings of unimaginable firepower. The Treaty of Olympus unified Terra and Mars under the Emperor's rule. Though the Mechanicum maintained significant autonomy, continuing to worship the machine god they called the Omnisia. Many among the Mechanicum came to believe that the Emperor was the physical incarnation of their Omnisia, a belief the Emperor neither confirmed nor denied. This calculated ambiguity typified the Emperor's approach to the spiritual beliefs of those he conquered. While establishing a secular imperial truth that denied the existence of gods and demons, he allowed certain existing faiths to persist when it served his purposes. This pragmatism would eventually prove his undoing. With Mars providing the ships, weapons, and machines of war, and Terra providing the warriors to wield them, the Emperor's forces grew from an army to an armada, from a conquering force to a crusading fleet capable of reclaiming the stars. Arch-Muggos Belisarius Cawl and other master artificers forged pacts with the Emperor, creating technological marvels that would serve as the backbone of imperial military might for millennia to come. The Astronomicon was established, a psychic beacon powered by the Emperor's own immense will, allowing navigator houses to guide ships through the warp with unprecedented accuracy. The immense administrative apparatus that would eventually become the Adeptus Terror began to take shape with the Emperor appointing trusted officers to manage the logistics of an interstellar empire. The foundations of the imperial war machine, the imperial army, the Titan legions, the first battle fleet Gothic stood ready to carry out their master's will. As these preparations reached their zenith, the Emperor gathered his inner circle atop the half-constructed imperial palace. The mountains that once dominated the Himalaya-Aegean region had been reshaped into defensive bastions and processional avenues. Where once techno-barbarians fought with scavenged weaponry, now stood the greatest concentration of military power human hands had ever assembled. "We go to the stars," the Emperor told his generals, his voice carrying the weight of absolute conviction. "Not as explorers but as inheritors. The galaxy is humanity's birthright. We shall reclaim what was lost." None among his advisors raised a voice in opposition. None dared question whether this crusade was necessary or what it might cost in blood and suffering. The Emperor had unified terror through force. Now that same implacable will would be directed outward toward the scattered remnants of mankind's fallen colonies. Those who welcomed imperial rule would be incorporated into the new order. Those who refused would be overcome. The die was cast. The Great Crusade would begin. In the last days before the Emperor's fleets departed Terror, port ants and omens proliferated among the population. Astropaths reported dreams of golden warriors marching across the stars. Navigators charting warp currents claimed to see paths opening before them like welcoming arms. Even the tech priests of Mars, normally bound to rationality by their cybernetic augmentations, spoke of favorable alignments in the cosmos, as if the universe itself acknowledged the rightness of the Emperor's cause. Whether these phenomena were genuine psychic foretellings or merely the product of minds caught up in the fervor of the moment remains a subject of debate among imperial scholars. What cannot be disputed is the sense of destiny that permeated Terror as the Great Crusade prepared to launch. A feeling that mankind stood on the threshold of its greatest ascension. The Emperor, however, seemed unmoved by such sentiments. His focus remained absolute, his determination undiluted by either doubt or triumphalism. When he finally boarded his flagship, the Bosphorus, he did not look back at the world he had unified through centuries of warfare. His gaze was fixed upon the future, a future he alone could envision in its totality. As the great fleet broke orbit and moved toward the Sol system's edge, those left behind on Terror watched the lights of thousands of ships dwindle to stars, then vanish among the true stars of the night sky. The age of strife was ending. The Great Crusade had begun. Humanity's long night would soon give way to a new dawn. Though few suspected how brief that dawn would be or how terrible the darkness that would follow. The Emperor's war to reclaim humanity's birthright would reshape the galaxy. Billions would die in his name. Entire species would be exterminated to make way for human expansion. And in the end, the greatest threat to the Emperor's vision would come not from alien civilizations or the hazards of the void, but from within, from his own sons, the primarchs he had created to lead mankind to its destiny. But that betrayal lay in the future, beyond the scope of ancient sight. As the Bucephalus activated its warp engines and translated into the Imperium, Carrying the master of mankind toward the first of countless conquests, the tides of history turned. The scattered shards of humanity, isolated and devolved during the long millennia of old night, would soon feel the tread of the Emperor's armies, bringing compliance, bringing imperial truth, bringing the light of unification to human worlds that had forgotten they were part of a greater whole. Whether they would welcome this light or curse it, the Great Crusade cared not. The Emperor had decreed that mankind would be one again, united under his rule. And so it would be, no matter the cost. The void between stars holds no memory of the ships that passed through it. 10,000 years after the Emperor's great fleet first ventured beyond Sol, the cosmic dust has forgotten the wake of those mighty vessels. Yet the worlds they visited bear the scars still in their architecture, in their customs, in the genetic memory of their populations. The Great Crusade was not merely conquest. It was transformation on a scale never before witnessed. From terror they came, 1,000 vessels bearing the Emperor's light. The warp drives pulsed with controlled immaterial energy, tearing holes in reality through which mankind would reclaim its scattered inheritance. The navigators, mutants with their third eye, forever gazing into the madness between dimensions, guided these ships through currents of insanity toward distant human colonies that had forgotten their origin. The Emperor stood upon the command deck of the Bucephalus, his presence so overwhelming that mortal crew members could not look directly at him without their retinas burning from the psychic radiance. Those favored enough to serve in his proximity learned to avert their gaze to witness his glory only in peripheral vision. Even then many went blind after years in his service, a sacrifice they counted as blessing. By his side stood Malcador, the Sigillite, ancient even then, his frail form housing a psychic, might second only to the master of mankind. Their first custodians formed a silent golden guard around them, both perfect warriors whose sole purpose was the Emperor's protection. Constantine Valder, their captain general, never strayed more than 10 paces from his leg, his guardian spear ready to intercept any threat, though none could imagine what might threaten the being who had united terror through force of will and blade. As the Crusade penetrated deeper into the galaxy, it encountered the first of humanity's lost colonies. Some welcomed the imperial truth with open arms, their populations having maintained legends of old Earth through the long isolation. These worlds underwent peaceful compliance, their technologies and resources absorbed into the growing Imperium, their populations subjected to the benevolent tyranny of progress. Others resisted worlds that had developed their own cultures, their own gods, their own definitions of what it meant to be human. These the Emperor's forces brought to compliance through graduated application of force. First diplomacy, then economic pressure, finally the unleashing of transhuman warriors who knew no defeat. The Space Marine legions, still without their Primarch fathers, nonetheless carved bloody paths through any who denied the imperial truth. The Luna Wolves, bearing the Emperor's own eye upon their pauldrons, became notorious for their swift decapitation strikes against enemy leadership. The Dark Angels, first among the legions, brought fire and sword to worlds that rejected compliance with cold, merciless efficiency. The Imperial Fists turned alien citadels into tomb fortresses for the Zeniths who had once claimed them. The Warhounds, later to become the World Eaters, left only compliance or extermination in their wake. Alongside these transhuman warriors marched the Imperial Army, baseline humans, augmented only by their faith in the Emperor's vision and the increasingly standardized weapons of the Mechanicum. Billions of mortal soldiers died, securing worlds that Space Marines had already broken, holding territory while the legions moved on to new conquests. Their sacrifice received no monuments, their names recorded only in dust-gathering archive stacks on distant terror. Yet without them, the Imperium could never have expanded across the galaxy. Behind the armies came the iterators and remembrances, propaganda agents and artists tasked with incorporating each world into the imperial culture, with documenting the glories of conquest for posterity. The iterators spoke of the imperial truth, the secular doctrine that denied the existence of gods and demons, that proclaimed humanity's manifest destiny among the stars. The remembrances captured the grandeur of compliance in paint and prose, in songs and sculptures that would inspire future generations. What they could not know, what perhaps even the Emperor with all his foresight did not fully anticipate, was how quickly their works would be consigned to the flames when the imperial truth collapsed. In later millennia, possession of remembrance of art became heresy punishable by death. The iterators' speeches once recorded in every compliance ceremony were declared blasphemy by the very Imperium they helped create. The first decades of the Crusade proceeded according to the Emperor's design. System by system, sector by sector, humanity's lost colonies were brought back into the fold. The Imperium expanded exponentially, its borders pushing ever outward from terror. Warp routes were secured, alien threats neutralized, human worlds restored to the birthright of imperial citizenship, whether they desired it or not. Then came the discovery that altered the Crusade's trajectory forever: the finding of the first Primarch. The records do not agree on which of the Emperor's gene sons was recovered first. Some chronicles name Lionel Johnson of the Dark Angels raised by beasts on the death world of Caliban. Others claim it was Leman Russ, feral king of Fenris, who first knelt before his creator. The Administratum sealed accounts suggest it might have been Horus himself, discovered on Chthoniya, so close to terror that some whispered he had never truly been lost at all. The truth matters less than the impact of these reunions. Each Primarch was a being of godlike power, physically and psychically superior to any human who had ever lived, save the Emperor himself. Each had been shaped by the world upon which they had landed, their inherent natures molded by adoptive cultures that ranged from barbaric to hyper-civilized. And each upon meeting the Emperor recognized their creator on some primal level that transcended conscious thought. As each Primarch was discovered, they assumed command of the legion created from their genetic template. The bond between Primarch and estates was immediate and profound. A connection of shared blood, shared purpose, shared transhuman perspective. Legions that had already established their combat, doctrines, and traditions sometimes chafed under new leadership, but the overwhelming charisma of the Primarchs inevitably reshaped their sons in their own image. The Lion brought knightly discipline to the Dark Angels. Purebo instilled merciless siegecraft in the Iron Warriors. Jagatai Khan taught the White Scars the art of swift, devastating strikes. Leman Russ transformed the Sixth Legion into the barbarian executioners known as the Space Wolves. Rogel Dawn perfected the defensive doctrines of the Imperial Fists. Conrad Kurs made the Night Lords into terror troops who fed on fear. Sanguinius elevated the Blood Angels with his own angelic nobility. Not all transitions were seamless. When Angron was found already implanted with neural devices that stimulated rage and bloodlust, his warhounds became the World Eatators, Berserkers, whose efficacy in combat was matched only by their increasing instability. When Logar Aurelian was discovered, already worshipping the Emperor as a god, the tension between his devout nature and his father's secular vision planted seeds that would later bear catastrophic fruit. As the number of recovered Primarchs grew, so did the complexity of relationships between these demigods. Brotherhoods formed. Sanguinius and Horus, Dawn and Helaman, Magnus and Lorgar. So too did rivalries. Pertoebo and Dawn, the Kun and the Lion, Kurs and Korax. The Emperor observed these developing dynamics, but made little effort to manage them, focusing instead on the expansion of the Imperium and the deeper mysteries that increasingly claimed his attention. The scale of the Great Crusade expanded with each Primarch's discovery. No longer was it merely the reunification of lost human colonies. It became the cleansing of entire sectors, the establishment of an interstellar hegemony under which aliens and human renegades alike were given a single option: submission or extermination. The Emperor's original vision, mankind, united and secure among the stars, began to transform into something broader, darker, more absolute in its scope. Entire species vanished before the Crusade's advance. The Eldari, ancient and declining even then, retreated deeper into their craft worlds rather than face imperial aggression. The Orcs, incapable of such strategic withdrawal, died by the billions, their worlds subjected to virus bombing and exterminatus protocols. Younger races, those who might have one day challenged humanity's dominance, were eliminated in their infancy. Their home systems turned to necropolises orbiting dead stars. Was this xenocide necessary? The imperial truth proclaimed that mankind's survival required the subjugation or destruction of all potential rivals. Later, imperial doctrine would go further, declaring the alien inherently corrupt, an offense against the God-Emperor's divine plan. But historians permitted to access the oldest archives sometimes whisper that treaties were attempted, that peaceful coexistence was offered to certain Xeno civilizations before the Emperor's more absolute policies took hold. If such offers were made, few aliens accepted them. The Great Crusade's reputation preceded it across the galaxy. Better to flee beyond the frontier of imperial expansion than trust in the mercy of transhuman warriors who had already demonstrated their capacity for genocide. The Imperium's borders became not merely political boundaries but ecological divides, humanity within, emptiness or hidden resistance without. As the 30th millennium approached its midpoint, the Crusade reached heights of conquest unprecedented in galactic history. At its peak, the Imperium was claiming 1,000 worlds a year, incorporating them into administrative sectors with ruthless efficiency. Entire planetary populations found their cultures, religions, and technologies replaced virtually overnight. Their ancient identities subsumed into imperial compliance. This era of expansion coincided with growing tensions within the imperial hierarchy. The emperor, increasingly absent from the front lines, delegated more authority to the primarchs and to the Council of Terror, a governing body established to administer the vast territories already brought to compliance. The primarchs, bred for conquest rather than governance, often found themselves at odds with civilian administrators who had never set foot on a battlefield. Most concerning was the emperor's decision to withdraw entirely from the crusade, returning to Terror to work on a secret project deep beneath the imperial palace. What this project entailed was known only to a handful of his most trusted advisors, Malcador among them, and perhaps Magnus the Red, whose psychic gifts made him uniquely capable of comprehending the Emperor's design. The official explanation that the Emperor sought to create a human-navigated webway that would free mankind from dependence on warp travel satisfied few of the primarchs who felt abandoned by their creator at the moment of their greatest triumphs. To maintain leadership of the Crusade, the Emperor elevated Horus Lupercal to the position of War Masteraster. First among equals, Horus would command not only his own lunar wolves, renamed the Sons of Horus in his honor, but would hold authority over all imperial forces, including his brother primarchs. It was a position of unprecedented power, entrusted to the son, in whom the emperor placed his greatest confidence. The appointment created immediate resentments. Guilliman of the Ultramarines, who commanded the largest legion and had brought the most worlds to compliance, questioned the wisdom of elevating Horus above the others. Purebo of the Iron Warriors, already bitter from being assigned the most grueling siege campaigns, saw it as further evidence of the emperor's favoritism. Angron of the World Eaters, whose neural implants fueled an ever-burning rage, cared nothing for titles, but resented any authority placed over him. Most dangerously, Lagerelian of the Wordbearsers harbored a grievance that went beyond politics. Decades earlier, the emperor had publicly humiliated Logar and his legion for spreading religious worship rather than the imperial truth. The Wordbearers had been forced to kneel in the ashes of Monarchia, a city they had built in the emperor's honor, as the master of mankind denounced their devotion as contrary to his secular vision. That Horus, who had participated in this censure, should now be elevated to the emperor's right hand festered like poison in Lorgar's psyche. Unknown to the Imperium at large, Lorgar had already begun seeking alternative objects of worship. His legion's path had taken them to the fringes of explored space, to worlds where the barrier between reality and the immaterium grew thin. There, through rituals that would later be classified as the darkest heresy, the Primarch of the Seven-Eye Legion communed with entities that offered him the validation his father had denied. Entities that named themselves gods and promised power to those who would serve them. The seeds of betrayal were planted long before they blossomed into open rebellion. While Lorgar pursued his forbidden communions, other fractures appeared in the Primarch's loyalty. Magnus the Red delved ever deeper into forbidden psychic arts. Convinced that mastery of the warp was humanity's destiny, despite the Emperor's restrictions, Alpharius and Omen, the twin primarchs of the Alpha Legion, began pursuing their own inscrutable agenda. Their true allegiance impossible to discern even by their closest brothers. Conrad Kurz, haunted by prophetic visions of betrayal and carnage, descended further into madness with each world his Night Lords terrorized into compliance. Most critically, Horus himself began to change under the burden of the War Master's mantle. The weight of commanding the crusade, combined with the Emperor's absence, strained even his formidable resilience. He found himself making decisions that affected billions of lives, unleashing destruction that would have been unimaginable during the Crusade's early years. When reports reached him of unrest on already compliant worlds, he responded with escalating brutality, believing that only through strength could the Imperium's future be secured. The final years of the Great Crusade saw the Imperium reach its pre-heresy zenith. From the borders of the halo stars to the eastern fringe. From the veiled region to the ghoul stars, Imperial forces pushed outward in all directions. New wonders and horrors were discovered daily. Lost human colonies that had evolved into unrecognizable forms. Alien civilizations both primitive and hyper-advanced. Worlds of such strange composition that they defied categorization. Throughout this expansion, the Mechanicum of Mars continued its uneasy alliance with the Imperium proper. The tech priests maintained their own beliefs, the worship of the machine god and the omnisia in blatant contradiction to the imperial truth. This religious exemption granted by the emperor himself caused friction with imperial authorities who were tasked with suppressing all other faiths. It also created an administrative division that would eventually solidify into the separation between the Adeptus Terror and the Adeptus Mechanicus. Beneath the surface of imperial unity, deeper currents were stirring. On 1,000 worlds, the imperial truth was being questioned, not by open rebellion, but by the persistent human tendency toward faith. The emperor's ban on religion had driven worship underground rather than eliminating it. Secret cults flourished in the underhives of industrial worlds, in the isolated communities of feudal planets, even among the crews of imperial warships who faced the horrors of the warp firsthand. What these scattered cults worshipped varied widely. Some venerated the emperor himself despite his explicit rejection of godhood. Others turned to older religions that had survived from old Earth. Still others developed entirely new theologies based on misunderstood fragments of the imperial truth. But common to all was the rejection of the sterile secularism that official doctrine demanded the human need to believe that something greater than mankind guided the universe. The imperial administration occupied with the logistics of managing an empire that expanded daily largely ignored these cultists unless they actively interfered with compliance. This tolerance or neglect would prove catastrophic when the heresy erupted and these disparate faiths were channeled into worship of the ruinous powers. As the Great Crusade entered what would be its final phase, strange phenomena began manifesting throughout imperial space. Astropaths reported increased difficulty in sending and receiving messages through the warp. Navigators spoke of shifting currents in the immaterium, of routes that had been stable for decades, suddenly becoming treacherous. On psych-heavy worlds, the incidence of possession and spontaneous combustion increased dramatically. The emperor sequestered in his laboratories beneath the palace gave no guidance regarding these omens. Whether he recognized them as harbingers of catastrophe and chose not to act, or whether even his transcendent intellect failed to perceive the danger remains one of history's great imponderables. Malcador the Sigillite, acting in his master's stead, ordered increased vigilance, but initiated no significant policy changes. Horus, meanwhile, found himself increasingly isolated from both his creator and many of his brothers. The burden of command separated him from the camaraderie of earlier years. Where once he had fought alongside fellow primarchs as an equal, now he dispatched them across the galaxy with the cold calculation of a supreme commander. The War Master's decisions determined which legions received glory and which were assigned to thankless duties, a power that inevitably bred resentment, even when wielded with perfect fairness. It was in this atmosphere of growing tension with the Emperor absent and the primarchs scattered across the stars that the pivotal moment of the crusade occurred. On the moon of Dave Neen, Horus Lupercal, greatest of the Emperor's sons, bearer of his authority, commander of his armies, was wounded by a weapon of unknown origin. The official accounts claim it was an assassin's blade tainted with alien poison. Later revisions would name it a warp-touched artifact, a key that unlocked the door to corruption. The War Master's injury resisted all efforts at treatment. As he lay dying aboard his flagship, the vengeful spirit, those closest to him, grew desperate. Among them were members of the warrior lodges, secret brotherhoods that had formed within many legions despite the Emperor's prohibition of such divided loyalties. These lodges had become conduits for ideas that ran counter to imperial doctrine, including ritual practices drawn from conquered worlds. It was these lodge brothers who suggested taking Horus to the Serpent Lodge on Davon's surface, where local healers claimed to possess cures beyond imperial medicine. The decision to remove the War Master Aster from his apothecary's care and place him in the hands of what were effectively witches marks the point at which the Great Crusade's path became irreversible. What transpired in the temple structures of Davon remained sealed under inquisitorial edict. Those who witnessed it firsthand either died during the heresy or were executed afterward to prevent the spread of dangerous knowledge. What emerged from that unholy place was no longer truly Horus Lupercal, though it wore his face and spoke with his voice. The greatest of the Primarchs had been turned. His loyalty to the Emperor replaced by bitter determination to overthrow the master he now saw as a tyrant and a liar. The corruption of Horus did not immediately manifest as open rebellion. For months, perhaps years, the War Master continued to direct the crusade while secretly turning key figures to his cause. His most significant early converts were Primarchs, who already harbored grievances. Loggar with his zealots' need for faith. Angron with his never-quenched rage. Fulgrim, whose pursuit of perfection had led him to damning influences. Through them, entire legions were gradually subverted, their loyalty redirected from terror to Horus. As the 30th millennium drew to a close, the Great Crusade's momentum began to falter. Expeditionary fleets that should have been claiming new worlds were instead being redirected to staging areas known only to the War Master. Communication between the legions became sporadic, with battle brothers who had once fought side by side now regarding each other with suspicion. The warrior lodges expanded their influence, identifying those who remained steadfastly loyal to terror and either converting or isolating them. Distant terror. The Emperor continued his work on the Human Webway project. His psychic awareness focused on holding back the demonic entities that sought to breach reality through the partially constructed portal. This concentration, necessary though it was, blinded him to the conspiracy forming among his sons. Even Mal Culler, with his network of informants stretching across the galaxy, detected only fragments of the approaching storm. The final days of the Great Crusade blended seamlessly into the opening moves of the Horus Heresy. There was no clear demarcation, no single moment when the Imperium's greatest achievement transformed into its greatest tragedy. The Wararm's treachery revealed itself gradually, strategically, beginning with the atrocity at Istvan III, where loyal elements of the traitor legions were culled in a virus bombing ordered by their own Primarchs. The dream of unity of mankind descendant among the stars, guided by the wisdom of the Emperor and the strength of his transhuman sons, died not with a thunderous declaration but with 1,000 quiet betrayals. The idealism that had launched 1,000 ships from terror decades earlier had calcified into rivalry, resentment, and finally hatred that would tear the galaxy apart. What followed was a civil war of such devastating scale that 10,000 years later, the Imperium still bears its scars. Brother would fight brother, father would fight son, and humanity's golden age would collapse into an era of superstition and endless war. The Great Crusade had promised unity and enlightenment. What it delivered was division and darkness that would endure until the stars themselves grew cold. Faith dies harder than flesh. In the ashes of Istvan III, this truth revealed itself as loyal estates, betrayed by their Primarchs, refused to accept their father's treachery, even as virus bombs consumed their bodies. Their devotion to the Emperor, a being who had rejected worship, ironically manifested as the very faith he had sought to eliminate from human consciousness. The scale of betrayal was beyond comprehension. For legions, the sons of Horus, Death Guard, Emperor's children, and World Eaters turned against their own battle brothers without warning. Thousands of loyal Est artists died in those initial hours, their armor melting into their skin as the Liphiateriator virus devoured everything organic on the planet's surface. The atmospheric firestorm that followed cremated what little remained. Yet somehow, impossibly, some survived. Entrenched in sealed bunkers or wearing fully enclosed armor, several hundred loyal Space Marines endured both the virus and the inferno. Captain Guri alone of the Sons of Horus, Captain Saul Tarvitz of the Emperor's Children, Ancient Ryaner, and others prepared their defense against what they knew would follow. Their Primarchs, discovering that not all had died in the viral apocalypse, would send forces to cleanse the surface personally. What followed was a massacre masquerading as battle. Outnumbered, outgunned, with no hope of rescue or reinforcement, the Loyalists fought with the desperate valor of the betrayed. For every traitor they killed, 10 more took their place. Their deaths were not swift. The World Eaters, in particular, already given to bloodlust even before their betrayal, dismembered their former brothers with chain axes, drawing out their executions with methodical brutality. From orbit, the Primarchs watched impassively. Horus Lupercal, once the most beloved of the Emperor's sons, Mortarion of the Death Guard, who had once despised all forms of corruption. Fulgrim of the Emperor's Children, whose pursuit of perfection had led him to the darkest forms of excess. Angron of the World Eatators, whose rage was the only constant in a mind fragmented by the butcher's nails implanted in his brain. 4 demigods who had turned from their father's light to the seductive darkness of the warp entities that some were already calling the Chaos Gods. The slaughter on Istvan III served 2 purposes. It eliminated those within the traitor legions who would have remained loyal to the Emperor, and it provided a blood sacrifice to the dark powers who had corrupted Horus and his brothers, a testament of devotion to replace the one they had once given to the master of mankind. As the last loyalists on Istvan III were being hunted through the ruins, a second greater betrayal was already in motion. 7 legions had been dispatched to confront Horus and his rebels: the Iron Warriors, Alpha Legion, Wordbearers, and Night Lords, followed by the Iron Hands, Raven Guard, and Salamanders. Of these, only the latter 3 remained truly loyal. The first 4 had already secretly pledged themselves to the War Master's cause. At Istvanvi, treachery was elevated from atrocity to art form. The Iron Hands, Raven Guard, and Salamanders made planetfall first, expecting the support of their brother legions. Instead, they found themselves caught between the original traitors and the 4 legions who now revealed their own betrayal. Ferrus Manus, Primarch of the Iron Hands, fell in personal combat with his once closest brother, Fulgrim. His severed head was presented to Horus as a trophy of loyalty. The Salamanders and Raven Guard were nearly annihilated, with Vulcan and Corax respectively believed lost. The Dropsite Massacre, as it came to be known, crippled the Emperor's ability to respond quickly to the rebellion. In a single day, 3 loyal legions had been devastated and the true extent of the conspiracy revealed. 8 of the 18 legions had turned against their creator. More than half of the Imperium's transhuman warriors now marched under the banner of the Eye of Horus rather than the Imperial Aquila. On Distant Terror, the news arrived like a physical blow. The Emperor, still engaged in his vital work within the Imperial dungeon, delegated the defense of the throne world to Malkador. Sigillite and the Primarchs, who remained loyal, Rogel Dawn of the Imperial Fists, who had never left the Emperor's side, and later Jagatai Khan of the White Scars and Sanguinius of the Blood Angels, who fought their way back through traitor-controlled space to stand with their father in the coming siege. Robert Gilliman of the Ultramarines, commanding the largest of all legions, found himself isolated in the realm of Ultramar by warp storms conjured by traitorous sorcery. The Wordbearers, under the fanatical Lorgar Aurelian, launched a surprise attack on the Ultramarines' fleet at Kaf, initiating a bitter war that would prevent Gilliman from coming to Terror's aid until it was too late. The Lion, Primarch of the Dark Angels, pursued his own campaigns against the traitors, his strategies as inscrutable as ever, while Russ and his Space Wolves were dispatched on a mission whose true purpose remained sealed in Imperial archives. The years that followed, Istvan saw the Imperium fractured into zones of war, loyalty, and confusion. The Ruin Storm, a massive warp disturbance created through word-bearer rituals, divided the galaxy, making astropathic communication unreliable and warp travel dangerous beyond measure. Entire sectors found themselves cut off from Imperial authority, forced to fend for themselves against both external threats and internal subversion. For as the Civil War raged in material space, another war was being fought for the very souls of humanity. Cultists emerged from hiding on countless worlds, revealing devotions to entities they called Khorne, Sench, Nurgle, and Slaanesh. Psychers, once rigorously controlled, broke their conditioning and opened themselves to possession. The warp, once a tool used by humanity to traverse the stars, revealed itself as a realm of malevolent consciousness, home to beings that fed on mortal emotion and saw mankind as both sustenance and plaything. The traitor Primarchs themselves underwent horrific transformations. Angron, whose rage had always threatened to consume him, embraced demonic possession, becoming a creature of pure wrath. Mortarion, who had once hated all forms of sorcery, became a vector for supernatural plagues. Magnus the Red, whose original loyalty remains debated by Imperial scholars, saw his legion of psychic warriors mutate into dust-shrouded automatons bound to his will. Fulgrim surrendered his physical form to a daemon of sensuous excess, while Lorgar Aurelian, architect of the religious corruption that had spread through the legions, ascended to a state of blasphemous enlightenment. Horus alone retained his appearance, though his soul had been irreversibly claimed by the ruinous powers. The War Master orchestrated the rebellion from his battle barge, the Vengeful Spirit, gathering his forces for the inevitable assault on Terror. His strategy was brutally simple: break through the Sol system's defenses, land on Terror, breach the Imperial Palace, and kill the Emperor before the Loyalist reinforcements could arrive. The war burned across the galaxy, but its heart always lay in the struggle between father and favored son. The Emperor had created the Primarchs as extensions of his own being, imbuing each with a portion of his power. In turning against his creator, Horus had not merely rebelled against authority, but had rejected his own essential nature. This spiritual self-mutilation, more than any physical transformation, marked the Wararm's true corruption. As Horus drove toward Terror, the Loyalists frantically prepared for the coming storm. Rogel Dawn, Taurian of Terror, oversaw the palace's transformation into the greatest fortress mankind had ever constructed. Defensive bastions rose from the Himalaya-Zian mountains. Void shields capable of withstanding orbital bombardment were calibrated to protect key structures. The Imperial Fists and the remnants of other loyal legions drilled endlessly, preparing for a siege that would determine humanity's fate. Malkador the Sigillite, acting with the Emperor's authority, created new institutions to face the unprecedented threat. The foundations of the Imperial Inquisition were laid in those desperate days along with the Grey Knights, a chapter of Space Marines engineered to resist chaotic corruption. The Officio Assassinum dispatched its most skilled agents to eliminate traitor commanders. Though all attempts on the Primarchs' lives failed, the Adeptus Mechanicus split with many tech priests following the renegade fabricator General Kelboril into alliance with Horus, while others remained loyal to the oaths sworn on Mars. The Wararm's advance was not unopposed. Loyalist forces harried the traitor fleet at every opportunity, sacrificing themselves in desperate holding actions to buy time for Terror's defenses. Space battles of staggering scale erupted throughout the solar system as the traitors pushed inexorably inward. The Saturnine shipyards fell. The Jupiter orbital, the platforms were overrun. The lunar defense batteries, after exacting a terrible toll on the invaders, were silenced one by one. Then Terror stood alone, a blue-green jewel in the void, birthplace of humanity and throne of the Emperor. From its surface, the citizens could see the traitor fleet filling the sky. Thousands of ships bearing the corrupted emblems of 8 Space Marine legions and their allied forces. Planetary defense batteries fired continuously, their energy beams tracing lines of desperate defiance through the atmosphere. Void shields flickered as they absorbed the retaliatory bombardment from orbit. The initial landings targeted the spaceports, seeking to establish beachheads from which the main traitor forces could be deployed. The Loyalists contested every meter, knowing that each hour they delayed the enemy brought the possibility of reinforcement closer. The Blood Angels, led by the angelic Sanguinius, performed feats of heroism that would later pass into legend, hurling back assault after assault. The White Scars under Jagatai Khan executed lightning raids against traitor positions, refusing to be drawn into static battles where the enemy's superior numbers would tell. But the palace perimeter was too vast, the defenders too few. Slowly, inexorably, the traitors established their siege lines. Titan legions that had turned against the Omnisia brought their apocalyptic firepower to bear on walls designed to withstand anything short of exterminatus. Heretical Techips deployed forbidden weapons that corrupted the very molecules of the palace's outer defenses. Plague Marines of the Death Guard released toxins that reduced thousands of defenders to bubbling pools of diseased tissue. Most terrifying were the creatures summoned from the warp through blood sacrifice and forbidden rituals. Demons manifested on Terror for the first time since the Emperor had cleared the planet of such entities during the Unification Wars. Reality itself became thin in places where the fighting was most intense, with buildings and combatants alike sometimes phasing partially into the immaterium affected by its non-Euclidean physics and maddening vistas. The siege grounded on for 55 days. The outer palace fell. The Sanctum Imperialis, where the Emperor continued his mysterious work, remained inviolate, but increasingly isolated. Casualties mounted beyond counting, with both sides feeding more troops into the meat grinder of urban warfare. Civilians died by the billions, some to collateral damage, others to starvation or thirst as basic services collapsed. Still others to the predations of cultists and demons that infested the hive cities beyond the combat zones. Through it all, the Emperor remained psychically active, but physically absent from the battle. His consciousness split between containing the breach in the Human Webway project, which threatened to become a permanent warp rift in the heart of the palace, and monitoring the progress of the war. His absence fueled resentment among some defenders who questioned why their godlike ruler would not take the field against his wayward son. Others maintained that the emperor's work, incomprehensible though it might be to mortal minds, was vital to humanity's survival beyond the immediate crisis. As the siege entered its final phase, Horus made his critical error. With loyalist reinforcements detected at the edge of the Sol system, the War Master lowered the void shields on his flagship, the Vengeful Spirit. In a deliberate invitation, he knew the Emperor would sense this opportunity to end the rebellion by confronting its leader directly. He counted on his creator's lingering sentimentality, the emotional attachment that had already led the Emperor to hesitate too long in responding to signs of the Primarch's corruption. The Emperor accepted the challenge, taking with him a small force of custodians, Imperial Fists, Blood Angels, and a single mortal remembrancer named Olanius Pa, whose significance remains debated. The Master of Mankind teleported from the palace to the Vengeful Spirit. The mission was simple in conception, but nearly impossible in execution. Kill Horus before the traitor forces could breach the inner sanctum of the palace. The teleportation affected by the warp disturbances surrounding the traitor flagship scattered the Imperial strike force throughout the vessel. The Emperor found himself alone, moving through corridors where reality had been reshaped by the Chaos God's influence. Space Marines, both loyal and traitor, fought desperate battles throughout the ship's labyrinthine interior. But the true confrontation would be between father and son. Sanguinius, separated from his leg, found Horus first. The Angel of Baal, most noble of the Primarchs, confronted his corrupted brother in single combat. Despite his supernatural strength and fighting skill, Sanguinius could not overcome the War Master, who now channeled the power of 4 Chaos Gods. The Primarch of the Blood Angels died at his brother's hands, his neck broken, his once perfect form discarded contemptuously on the deck of the bridge. When the Emperor finally reached the scene, he found his favored son standing over the corpse of his brother. What words passed between them went unrecorded. Some accounts claim they battled psychically first, their powerful minds clashing before a single physical blow was struck. Others suggest the Emperor hesitated, still seeking to redeem rather than destroy his creation. The truth died with those who witnessed it. The physical battle between the Emperor and Horus has been depicted countless times in Imperial art, usually showing a straightforward duel between divine light and corrupted darkness. The reality was infinitely more complex. Both beings wielded powers beyond mortal comprehension. Reality warped around them as they fought, the material and immaterial realms bleeding into one another. Visions of possible futures and parallel timelines flickered through the ship's bridge as father and son tore at the fabric of existence itself with their conflict. The Emperor held back, still unwilling to unleash his full power against his own creation. Horus, freed from any such restraint, inflicted grievous wounds on his maker. The Master of Mankind was driven to his knees, his immortal body failing under assaults no merely human form could have withstood for an instant. What finally changed the Emperor's mind remains a subject of theological debate. The most common version of events taught to Imperial children as sacred history holds that Horus slew Aeneas Pa, a mortal soldier who placed himself between the War Master and the wounded Emperor. This ultimate display of both human courage and the War Master's irredeemable cruelty convinced the Emperor that Horus was truly lost. Other accounts claim it was the psychic realization of what would happen should Horus triumph the enslavement of mankind to chaos for eternity that steeled the Emperor's resolve. The truth, like so much from that era, is shrouded in myth and deliberate obfuscation. Whatever the catalyst, the Emperor finally unleashed his full power against his fallen son. Divine energies drawn from the same source that had created the Primarchs in the first place obliterated Horus's physical form and scoured his very soul from existence. The War Master, who had nearly succeeded in his rebellion, was erased so completely that even the Chaos Gods could not reconstitute him. The psychic backlash of this confrontation rippled through the warp felt by psychers across the galaxy. On Terror, the traitor forces, many of whom had been sustained by Horus' will, fell into disarray. The death of their leader, coupled with the arrival of loyalist reinforcements led by Rabut Guilliman's Ultramarines, broke the siege. The traitor legions, recognizing their defeat, fled from Terror toward the Eye of Terror, a massive warp storm where reality and the Immaterium permanently overlapped, creating a refuge where they could nurse their hatred for the next 10,000 years. Victory came at an unbearable price. The Emperor, mortally wounded in his battle with Horus, could no longer heal himself as he had countless times before. His ruined body was recovered from the vengeful spirit by Rogel Dawn, who wept openly at the sight of his father's broken form. Following the Emperor's nearly incoherent final instructions, Dawn supervised the modification of the Golden Throne, originally designed as an interface with the human Webway project to serve as a life support system. The supreme sacrifice demanded one final architect. Malkador, the Sigillite, oldest and most loyal of the Emperor's servants, already exhausted from maintaining the throne's functions during his master's absence, surrendered his remaining life force to sustain the Emperor's transition. The ancient Psycheer crumbled to dust, his millennia of service ending in one last act of devotion. Thus began the Emperor's long imprisonment. Neither truly alive nor fully dead, his immense psychic power focused on maintaining the astronomicon that makes warp travel possible. While his consciousness fragments across time and space in ways no mortal mind can comprehend. His withered corpse, sustained by arcane technology and the daily sacrifice of 1,000 psychers, became the object of veneration for the religion he had sought to prevent. The aftermath of the heresy saw the Imperium transformed almost beyond recognition. Rogel Dawn and Robot Helaman led the reconstruction efforts, implementing contingency plans the Emperor had prepared but never intended to use. The Space Marine legions, proven vulnerable to corruption when concentrated under a single commander, were broken down into 1,000 warrior chapters as prescribed in Gilman's Codex Est Artis. The Imperial Army was similarly divided into the Imperial Guard and Imperial Navy, ensuring that no single commander could control both ground forces and space transport. Most significant was the rise of the Imperial cult. During the Great Crusade, the Emperor had suppressed religion, presenting himself as merely the most advanced human being rather than a god. After his internment on the Golden Throne, this distinction collapsed. Desperate for meaning in the aftermath of near extinction, humanity embraced the worship of the Emperor as divine, a belief actively encouraged by political leaders who recognized its usefulness in maintaining order. The bitter irony of this development would not have been lost on the Emperor had his consciousness remained fully intact. The secular empire he had fought to establish was replaced by the very theocracy he had sought to prevent. The imperial truth gave way to the imperial creed. The master of mankind became the God Emperor. His physical absence transmuted into spiritual omnipresence. His silence interpreted as divine mystery. As for the traitors, their fate was sealed by their own actions. The ruinous powers, having used Horus as their instrument, discarded the remnants of his rebellion like broken toys. The surviving primarchs who had turned against the Emperor found themselves trapped in a cycle of endless war both against the Imperium and each other. Their legions fragmented into war bands. Their transhuman bodies mutating to reflect their spiritual corruption. Their memories of brotherhood and purpose replaced by hate and the pursuit of personal power. The Great Crusade had promised to unite humanity under the imperial truth to free mankind from superstition and usher in an age of reason and progress. The Horus heresy ensured that promise would never be fulfilled. Instead of advancing, humanity retreated into a dark age of faith and fear, of stagnation and constant war. The cost of survival was the sacrifice of everything that made survival worthwhile. And yet survive mankind did. Despite the wounds inflicted by the heresy wounds that would never truly heal humanity endured, the Imperium, restructured around the worship of its entombed ruler, continued to hold most of the territory it had claimed during the Great Crusade. New heroes emerged to replace the fallen primarchs. New institutions arose to address the weaknesses revealed by civil war. 10,000 years later, Imperial historians would look back on the heresy as both the Imperium's darkest hour and paradoxically the crucible in which its enduring form was forged. Without the Emperor to guide them directly, humans learned to guide themselves, often brutally, frequently unjustly, but with a stubborn determination that would have made their creator proud. Had pride still been an emotion, his fragmentary consciousness could feel. In the ashes of betrayal, the Imperium of man found not the perfection the Emperor had envisioned, but something more characteristically human. The imperfect, unbending will persist despite all reason, all logic, all cost. Angels had fallen, but mankind remained. The light of the Astronomicon reached across the void, illuminating the remnants of mankind's broken empire. It burned neither warm nor cold. This psychic beacon merely constant, unyielding, drawing sustenance from souls fed into its eternal hunger. From the Golden Throne, The Emperor's withered corpse presided over humanity's long twilight. Not dead, yet never again truly alive. In the aftermath of the heresy, the Imperium lay bleeding from 1,000 wounds. Terror's soil had drunk the blood of millions. Mars smoldered with the fires of schism. Entire systems had been reduced to lifeless rock by bombardment or virus bombing. Warp storms still raged across vast swaths of the galaxy, isolating human worlds from each other and from central authority. The traitor legions had retreated into the Eye of Terror, but their corruption lingered in hidden cults and tainted bloodlines scattered across countless planets. It fell to the survivors to salvage what remained of the Emperor's dream. Robert Gil Lyman, Primarch of the Ultramarines, emerged as the natural leader of the reconstruction, while Rogel Dawn oversaw the rebuilding of the Imperial Palace, converting it from a besieged fortress back into the nerve center of galactic administration. Gilliman tackled the more fundamental question: how to prevent another heresy from destroying what remained of human civilization. His answer was the Codex Est Artis, a comprehensive reorganization of Imperial military forces designed to prevent any single commander from controlling enough power to threaten the Imperium again. The Space Marine legions, once numbering tens or even hundreds of thousands of warriors under the direct command of a Primarch, would be broken into chapters of no more than 1,000 Astartes each, led by a chapter master answerable to the High Lords of Terror. Not all the surviving loyalist Primarchs accepted this restructuring willingly. Rogel Dawn and Leman Russ in particular saw it as an overreaction, arguing that smaller chapters would be less effective against the myriad threats facing mankind. Vulcan and Corax, having witnessed the devastation at Istvan firsthand, supported Gilman's reforms. The Iron Hands, still mourning their Primarch Ferrus Manus, complied, but grew increasingly reclusive, replacing their grief with cold logic and mechanical augmentation. The Imperial Army underwent a similar division, split into the Astroi Terram, Imperial Guard, responsible for ground warfare, and the Imperial Navy controlling void-based operations. Never again would a single commander have authority over both the means of transport and the troops themselves. The Mechanicum of Mars, purged of its most obvious traitors, was reorganized as the Adeptus Mechanicus, its religious doctrine of machine worship formalized rather than suppressed as it had been under the Emperor's secular rule. Most significantly, the Imperial Truth, the Emperor's atheistic doctrine that had formed the philosophical core of the Great Crusade, was quietly abandoned. In its place arose the Imperial Creed, which venerated the Emperor as the god of mankind. His physical incapacitation reinterpreted as spiritual transcendence. The ecclesiarchy grew from scattered cults into the official state religion with a presence on every world and authority that rivaled the administratum itself. This transformation represented the final death of the Emperor's vision. He had sought to free humanity from superstition and religious dogma. Now his immobile form became the focus of the most widespread faith in galactic history. Those who had known him personally, the Primarchs, the Custodians, the highest-ranking Imperial officials, recognized this irony, but did little to counter it. Faith gave purpose to a traumatized population. It provided the social cohesion needed to maintain Imperial unity across incomprehensible distances. And most importantly, it established a framework through which the increasingly Byzantine imperial bureaucracy could justify its authority. As the first centuries after the heresy passed, the Primarchs began to disappear. Gilliman departed on a campaign against the traitor Alpha Legion. Rogel Dawn vanished during a Black Crusade, leaving behind only his severed hand. Leman Russ gathered his Wolf Guard and ventured into the Eye of Terror, promising to return for the Wolf Time, a prophesized final battle. Vulcan simply walked away from his chapter, his immortal form presumably still wandering the galaxy on missions known only to himself. Jagatai Khan pursued Dark Ealer raiders into a webway portal and never returned. Corax, consumed by guilt over his failed attempt to rapidly rebuild his decimated Raven Guard, transformed into something no longer fully human and vanished into the shadows. By the end of the 31st millennium, all the loyal Primarchs had passed into legend. Their absence left a vacuum of authority and purpose that the High Lords of Terror attempted to fill through increasingly rigid adherence to procedure and tradition. Without the Emperor's direct guidance or the charismatic leadership of his superhuman sons, the Imperium's administration calcified into bureaucratic stagnation. The time of rebirth, as Imperial historians named the period immediately following the heresy, saw heroic efforts to reconsolidate Imperial territory. Countless crusades were launched to reclaim worlds lost during the Civil War or subsequently overrun by Xeno's predators, taking advantage of human weakness. The Ultramarines, Iron Hands, Imperial Fists, and their successor chapters led these campaigns, establishing a pattern that would be repeated endlessly over the coming millennia. Territory gained through enormous sacrifice, held briefly, then lost again as attention shifted to new threats. Technology, once the bedrock of human advancement, transformed into religious mystery. The Adeptus Mechanicus, having lost much of its understanding during the Schism of Mars, began treating machinery as sacred objects to be venerated rather than comprehended. Innovation became heresy. Discovery was replaced by archaeology as tech priests devoted their efforts to uncovering lost knowledge rather than creating new understanding. Standard template constructs. The masterworks of the Dark Age of technology became holy grails sought with fanatical devotion across ruined worlds. The psychological trauma of the heresy expressed itself in institutional paranoia. The Inquisition, founded during the Siege of Terror, expanded its mandate from combating chaotic corruption to monitoring all potential threats to imperial stability. The Ordo Malus hunted demons and those who summoned them. The Ordo Hereticus sought out political and religious deviation. The Ordo Xenos pursued alien influence in any form, operating outside the normal chain of command, answerable only to the Emperor himself, who could no longer directly oversee them. Inquisitors wielded absolute authority to condemn worlds to destruction if they perceived sufficient threat. This power was not theoretical. In the 32nd millennium alone, records indicate over 400 planets subjected to exterminatus obliteration through cyclonic torpedoes, virus bombs, or mass bombardment. Some genuinely harbored irredeemable corruption. Others fell victim to individual inquisitors' paranoia or factional rivalries within the Inquisition itself. The exact number will never be known as many such actions were stricken from official records. The worlds themselves removed from navigational charts as if they had never existed. As the centuries stretched into millennia, the Imperium's character transformed from the secular empire of scientific progress the Emperor had envisioned into a religiously motivated, technologically regressive state, focused solely on its own survival. Innovation was replaced by ritual. Efficiency gave way to tradition. Knowledge became the province of a privileged few. While the vast majority of imperial citizens lived in superstitious ignorance of the wider galaxy, knowing only that they must work, pray, and if necessary, die in service to the God Emperor. The institutional changes were matched by physical deterioration. The infrastructure established during the Great Crusade transit networks, industrial complexes, agricultural systems began to fail without the technical expertise to maintain it properly. Hive cities originally designed as efficient population centers degenerated into stratified warren where the privileged few lived in upper spires while the masses crowded into polluted underhives. Forge worlds once centers of technological innovation became temple factories where tech priests performed production rituals they no longer fully understood. Manufacturing weapons and vehicles according to templates 10,000 years old. Even the Emperor's physical form reflected this decay. The Golden Throne, never designed to sustain a mortally wounded demigod for millennia, required increasingly drastic measures to maintain. The original 1,000 psychers sacrificed daily to fuel the Emperor's life. Support grew to tens of thousands as the throne's efficiency declined. The Mechanicus performed desperate jury-rigged repairs on machinery they could no longer replicate, knowing that failure would mean not only the Emperor's final death, but the collapse of the Astronomicon, and with it, all faster than light travel and communication across the Imperium. The 32nd millennium brought new challenges that tested the reformulated Imperium's resilience. The first recorded Black Crusade erupted from the Eye of Terror under the leadership of Abaddon the Despoiler, former first captain of the Sons of Horus and self-proclaimed heir to the War Arm Master's legacy. Unlike Horus, Abaddon refused to pledge himself directly to the Chaos Gods, maintaining a degree of independence that made him uniquely dangerous. His assault devastated the Cadian sector before being turned back by forces led by the hero Sigismund, first captain of the Imperial Fists. This would establish the pattern for millennia to come. Periodic eruptions from the Eye of Terror, each causing massive damage before being contained at tremendous cost. Between these Black Crusades, the traitor legions now broken into war bands like their loyalist counterparts. But without the discipline of the Codex, Est Artis conducted their own smaller raids into imperial space. each driven by their particular obsessions and the demands of their patron gods. The wordbearers sought to spread the worship of chaos, establishing cults that would ferment rebellion from within. The Death Guard brought plagues that reduced prosperous worlds to septic channel houses. The Emperor's children pursued increasingly extreme sensations, leaving behind planets whose populations had been driven to insanity through exposure to sounds, chemicals, and experiences beyond human tolerance. The World Eaters simply killed their only purpose, the collection of skulls for K's brass throne. Against these threats, the Adeptus Estates stood as humanity's bulwark. The Loyalist legions, now reorganized into hundreds of chapters spread across the galaxy, maintained vigils over threatened sectors. Some retained close ties to their parent legions, the Ultramarines, successors in particular, forming an interlocking network throughout Ultima Segmentum. Others developed entirely new identities and combat doctrines, adapting to specific threats or environmental conditions in their assigned territories. Yet even these transhuman warriors, created through technology that was increasingly poorly understood, began to suffer from degradation over time. Gene seed, the complex biological material that transformed ordinary humans into space marines, became less stable with each generation of implantation. Mutation rates increased. Some chapters discovered they could no longer use certain organs from the original template, such as the Becher's gland or Susan membrane. Others developed unique flaws, the Blood Angel's red thirst, the Space Wolf's wolf and curse that threatened their combat effectiveness or even their sanity. The Mechanicus lacked both the understanding and the technological capability to correct these degradations. Instead, affected chapters developed cultural practices to conceal or control their flaws. The Blood Angels ritualized blood consumption. The Space Wolves incorporated their tendency toward bestial mutation into their tribal mythology. The Imperial Fists intensified their pain endurance practices to master emotions that their damaged Cat-Alps node would otherwise leave uncontrolled. Thus, even the Imperium's most perfect warriors embodied its broader deterioration functioning, but far from the flawless instruments they had been during the Great Crusade. Like everything in the Imperium, they were diminished echoes of past glory, making do with degraded capabilities through sheer determination and institutionalized ritual. The Age of Apostasy in the 36th millennium marked perhaps the nadir era of imperial governance. Gorg Vandera, simultaneously master of the Administratum and ecclesiarch of the Adeptus Minorum, instituted a reign of terror driven by paranoia and messianic delusion. For 7 decades, Van Dyer redirected vast imperial resources to personal projects, executed rivals on the slightest suspicion, and demanded worship as the Emperor's only true representative among humanity. The Reign of Blood, as this period became known, ended only when Vania's personal bodyguard, the Brides of the Emperor, later reorganized as the Adeptus Sororitas or Sisters of Battle, were convinced of his heresy by Sebastian Thor, a charismatic preacher who would become the next ecclesiarch. The sisters turned on Van Eyre, executing the man who had claimed to speak for the Emperor. The resulting reforms established the decree passive, which prevented the ecclesiarchy from maintaining men under arms, a restriction circumvented by staffing the Sisters of Battle exclusively with women and theoretically separated church authority from administratum control. Yet the underlying conditions that had allowed Vania's rise remained. The Emperor could not govern. The Primarchs were gone. The High Lords of Terror, theoretically the Emperor's regents, were political appointees representing competing institutional interests rather than unified imperial vision. The reforms that followed the Age of Apostasy addressed specific abuses without resolving the fundamental problem without clear charismatic leadership. The Imperium defaulted to authoritarian control maintained through fear, superstition, and institutional momentum. Against this backdrop of internal decay, external threats multiplied. The Orcs present since before human interstellar expansion periodically unified under particularly successful warlords to create massive wags that devastated entire sectors. The Eldar, though diminished from their pre-fall empire, conducted targeted strikes against human worlds based on prophetic visions. Their incomprehensible motivations making them impossible to predict or appease. The Dark Elder emerged from the webway to raid vulnerable colonies, taking captives for purposes too horrific to detail in imperial records. New Xenos threats emerged as well. The Tau, a technologically advanced species from the Eastern Fringe, began expanding their own empire based on a collectivist philosophy called the Greater Good. Though small by imperial standards, the Toa's technological innovation, free from religious restrictions that hampered human development, allowed them to challenge much larger imperial forces. Their willingness to incorporate other species, including humans, into their society presented an ideological threat that the Imperium found more disturbing than their military capabilities. More terrifying still were the Tyranids' extragalactic predators, who arrived in successive hive fleets, each containing billions of bioengineered organisms directed by a collective consciousness known as the hive mind. These creatures existed solely to consume biomass, stripping entire planets of all organic material before moving on to their next target. Imperial xenobiologists theorized that the hive fleets encountered thus far represented mere tendrils of a far larger Tyranid presence approaching from intergalactic space, a hypothesis too horrifying for most Imperial authorities to acknowledge publicly. The Necrons, ancient mechanical beings who had slumbered in tomb worlds for millions of years, began awakening in response to increased psychic activity across the galaxy. These soulless constructs, whose technology far surpassed even the heights of the Dark Age of technology, sought to reclaim worlds they considered rightfully theirs since before humanity's evolution. Their Gauss weapons capable of disintegrating matter at the molecular level and their living metal bodies that self-repaired from almost any damage made them virtually impossible to permanently defeat. Against this constellation of threats, the Imperium adopted a strategy that was less military doctrine than existential philosophy. Endure. Planets would be lost and reclaimed. Sectors would fall into rebellion and be reconquered. Entire populations would die defending worlds that most high-ranking Imperials couldn't locate on a galactic map without assistance. None of it mattered except the continuation of the Imperium itself, the preservation of human civilization in whatever degraded authoritarian form it now took. The Adeptus Terror, the massive bureaucracy that administered the Imperium, exemplified both the system's failure and its strain effectiveness. Countless scribes spent their entire lives copying documents they could not read in languages they did not understand. Planetary tithes were calculated according to assessments centuries or millennia out of date. Reinforcements were dispatched to worlds already lost while urgent pleas for aid went unanswered due to mis-outing or simple indifference. Yet somehow through the sheer weight of its operations, this dysfunctional colossus continued functioning. If one administrator failed, another would eventually notice and compensate. If a subsector fell to rebellion or Xenos invasion, neighboring sectors would eventually organize a response not from altruism, but from self-preservation. The Imperium was too vast, too redundant, too stubborn to collapse entirely, even as it failed its citizens in countless individual instances. This strange resilience extended to Imperial technology. The finest weapons and vehicles were no longer innovations, but archaeological treasures, relics recovered from battlefields of the Great Crusade or the Horus Heresy, maintained through religious devotion rather than technical understanding. Land raiders, Terminator armor, plasma weapons of the highest quality. These were irreplaceable artifacts assigned to the most elite units and passed down through generations of warriors. When they failed beyond repair, the Imperium's capabilities diminished by that small increment, never to be recovered. Yet necessity drove adaptation even within this technologically regressive framework. The Adeptus developed acts of faith, seemingly miraculous abilities fueled by absolute devotion to the Emperor. The Grey Knights, a secret chapter created specifically to combat demonic entities, refined psychic techniques that turned their minds into weapons as potent as their nemesis force weapons. The Adeptus Mechanicus, while forbidden from true innovation, became expert at repurposing and combining existing technologies in ways that created the illusion of progress while respecting the letter of their religious prohibitions. These adaptations helped the Imperium survive, but could not restore its former capabilities. The highest achievements of the Great Crusade era, the Gloriana-class battleships, the most advanced Mechanicum constructs, the genetic engineering that had created the Primarchs remained beyond the Imperium's degraded technical understanding. Each passing century saw more knowledge lost, more workarounds implemented, more compromises accepted as the new baseline. The 41st millennium found the Imperium stretched to breaking point. The Despoiler's 12th Black Crusade had shattered the Cadian Gate, the primary defensive network guarding against eruptions from the Eye of Terror. Hive Fleet Leviathan approached from below the galactic plane, bypassing many of the defensive systems established to counter previous Tyranid invasions. The Necron Awakening had progressed from isolated tomb worlds to coordinated dynasties, reclaiming entire systems according to territorial claims established before humanity's ancestors had mastered fire. Against this backdrop of existential threats, the Imperium turned increasingly to faith rather than strategy. The imperial cult reached the apotheosis of its influence with planetary governors enforcing daily prayer quotas and maintaining ever larger cathedrals while basic infrastructure crumbled. The ecclesiarchy's preachers proclaimed the end times, declaring that the God Emperor was testing humanity's devotion before his inevitable return to lead mankind to final victory against its enemies. This religious fervor expressed itself in massive pilgrimages with billions of imperial citizens abandoning their assigned roles to travel toward Terror or other shrine worlds. Entire subsectors found their economic productivity collapsing as workers departed en masse, drawn by promises of spiritual salvation. Those who could not undertake physical pilgrimages engaged in extreme devotional practices: self-flagellation, voluntary amputation, sensory deprivation, or continuous prayer that left no time for sleep or nourishment. Imperial authorities responded inconsistently to this phenomenon. Some recognized the threat to productivity and attempted to suppress the pilgrimages through force, creating martyrs whose deaths only intensified religious fervor. Others embraced and attempted to channel this energy, redirecting pilgrims into Futura's militia units that could supplement PDF forces against external threats. Still others simply stood aside, fatalistic in their assessment that if the Emperor truly wanted the Imperium to survive, he would ensure it did so regardless of human error. The Adeptus est Artis, nominally outside imperial religious structures due to their direct lineage from the Emperor's work, nonetheless could not remain untouched by the spiritual currents sweeping the Imperium. Many chapters intensified their own devotional practices, reframing their primarchs as saintly figures and the Emperor as a deity despite historical evidence of his rejection of such worship. Others maintained a more nuanced understanding of imperial history, but found it politically expedient to adopt religious language when interacting with other imperial institutions. A few chapters, most notably the Space Wolves, Celestial Lions, and certain successors of the Ultramarines, attempted to resist the Imperium's descent into unreasoning faith and cruelty. They intervened to protect civilians from inquisitorial purges, challenged corrupt planetary governors, or maintained enclaves where something closer to the Emperor's original vision survived. Their efforts, though heroic, affected only tiny regions of space islands of relative enlightenment in an ocean of superstition and decay. 10,000 years after the Emperor's internment on the Golden Throne, his Imperium had become a grotesque parody of his intentions. The Great Crusade had sought to unite humanity through reason and shared purpose. The Imperium of the 41st millennium maintained unity through fear, dogma, and the constant threat of external annihilation. The imperial truth had offered liberation from superstition. The imperial creed demanded unquestioning faith backed by threat of execution. The Emperor had envisioned human advancement free from the tyranny of gods. His crippled body now received worship from trillions who knew nothing of his true nature or goals. Yet for all its decay, the Imperium endured. Planets fell and were reconquered. Crusades failed, but were succeeded by new campaigns. Trillions died, but humanity as a species survived. The lights of civilization, though dim to their lowest ebb in millennia, still burned across tens of thousands of worlds. Whether through the Emperor's continuing intervention, the sheer momentum of such a vast enterprise, or simply the stubborn determination of a species that refused extinction, mankind maintained its galactic presence against all rational expectation. In the bleak darkness of the far future, there was only war unending, purposeless beyond mere survival, grinding whole generations to dust beneath its treads. But while war continued, so too did humanity. Perhaps that, rather than any nobler vision, had become the Emperor's final legacy. Not progress or enlightenment, but simple, brutal persistence against a universe that offered only hostility and despair. The void between stars holds no echo of screams. Billions have died in the vacuum, their final moments spent clawing at sealed visors or clutching at decompression wounds. Yet space remembers nothing. It is mankind that carries the burden of memory through picked recordings, through oral traditions, through nightmares passed from generation to generation. War is the Imperium's inheritance, its present state, and its only conceivable future. In the latter half of the 41st millennium, conflict reached a fever pitch unmatched since the Horus Heresy. No longer were wars fought for conquest or even survival alone. They had become the natural state of existence, the background radiation against which all human experience played out. Children born on Cadian fortress worlds learned weapon drills before they could walk. Skolola progenium orphans absorbed tactics alongside their catechisms. Even on worlds far from active fronts, the culture of militarism permeated every aspect of imperial life. The scale of warfare expanded beyond comprehension. A minor border conflict might involve billions of imperial guardsmen fighting across dozens of planets for centuries. Casualties that would have broken ancient civilizations became statistical rounding errors noted by logistics adepts only as they affected requisition calculations. The mass production of weaponry consumed entire worlds, forge complexes covering continents to produce an endless stream of lost guns, artillery, shells, and armored vehicles that would be destroyed within days of reaching the front. At the heart of this perpetual slaughter stood the Emperor's finest warriors, the Adeptuses. Once they had been instruments of conquest, expanding the Imperium across the galaxy. Now they served as the last bulwark against its collapse. A thin line of transhuman defenders stretched impossibly thin across 10,000 threatened worlds. The successors of Guilliman's Ultramarines formed the backbone of this defense. From their realm of Ultramar, a mini-empire within the Imperium. Chapters like the Nova Marines, Genesis Chapter, and Mortifactors deployed across the galaxy, carrying their Primarch's tactical doctrines to war zones where they were increasingly outmatched by the sheer scale of the threats they faced. The Sons of Dawn Imperial Fists, Crimson Fists, Black Templars, held fortified positions that by rights should have fallen 100 times over. Their stubborn determination, compensating for strategic situations that logic declared hopeless. No threat loomed larger in Imperial strategic calculations than the Tyranids. First encountered by the Ultramarines during the battle for Macrae in 745, M41, these extragalactic predators represented an existential challenge unlike anything humanity had previously faced. They did not seek conquest or subjugation, only consumption. Every world they touched was reduced to airless rock, its biomass devoured and repurposed into more tyrannid organisms. Worse still, their hive mind presence cast a psychic shadow through the warp, disrupting astropathic communication and preventing reinforcements from responding effectively to their lightning advances. The first major incursion, designated Hive Fleet Behemoth, had been barely contained at Macraj, where the entire first company of the Ultramarines perished in desperate last stands throughout the polar fortresses. The second Hive Fleet Kraken shattered against the defenses of Eker 4, but not before devastating dozens of worlds throughout the eastern fringe. The third, Leviathan, approached from below the galactic plane, bypassing established defenses and threatening to consume the heart of Segmentum Solar itself. Each Hive fleet employed different tactical approaches, adapting to Imperial responses with terrifying speed. Behemoth had relied on overwhelming force, sending waves of organisms directly against the strongest opposition. Kraken dispersed into countless splinter fleets, forcing Imperial defenses to spread themselves thin before concentrating on vulnerable targets. Leviathan employed a strategy of infiltration, seeding advanced forces disguised as meteors to establish cults among local populations before the main fleet arrived. What Imperial strategists found most disturbing was the evidence that these hive fleets represented mere tendrils of a far larger extragalactic presence. The Great Devourer approaching the Milky Way up, consuming countless other galaxies. If true, no calculation of forces suggested the possibility of ultimate victory. The Tyranids' biomass conversion was too efficient, their adaptability too perfect, their numbers too vast. The Imperium could only hope to delay them, to preserve what worlds they could for as long as possible, while searching desperately for some weakness that might offer salvation. Against this backdrop of slow extinction, other alien threats might have seemed secondary. Yet, each presented its own existential challenge to human dominance. The Orcs, ever present since mankind's first ventures beyond Terror, experienced a resurgence in the late 41st millennium. On Armageddon, the beast Gazal Thra led 3 successive WAHS against Imperial defenses, each larger than the last. What had begun as a typical greenskin rampage revealed itself as something far more ominous, a coordinated campaign directed by an Orc warlord of unprecedented strategic acumen. The wars for Armageddon consumed Imperial resources on a scale usually reserved for Black Crusades. Hive cities fell and were reclaimed dozens of times, their infrastructure reduced to rubble that provided perfect cover for ongoing Orc insurgencies. The Steel Legion regiments of the Imperial Guard fought alongside Titans of the Adeptus Mechanicus and multiple Space Marine chapters, including the Salamanders and Black Templars. Victory, when it came, was Pyrrhic. Armageddon remained technically in Imperial hands, but as a blasted wasteland requiring constant vigilance against Orc resurgence. More concerning to Imperial strategists was the evidence that Ghazghkull had departed before the final battles, taking his core forces to build a larger wear. Elsewhere, Commissar Yarrick, the human general who had become the Beast's nemesis through 3 campaigns, requested permission to lead a pursuit force. His request was denied. The Imperium could not spare the resources to chase one Orc warlord. When H-100 other threats demanded immediate attention, the Necrons presented a different kind of threat. Ancient, patient, and wielding technology that violated what Imperial science considered possible. Their tomb worlds had begun awakening in increasing numbers. Their metallic legions emerging from stasis to reclaim territories they considered rightfully theirs since before humanity's evolution. Unlike the Tyranids or Orcs, the Necrons did not seek to consume or simply destroy. They pursued the methodical eradication of all life, which they regarded as an affront to the purity of the material universe. What made the Necron threat particularly insidious was the impossibility of conventional victory against them. Their living metal bodies repaired even catastrophic damage given time. Their weapons, particularly the dreaded Gauss flares that stripped victims molecule by molecule, ignored armor and penetrated even the most sophisticated void shields. Most concerning, their phase technology allowed them to simply vanish when facing defeat, teleporting their forces back to tomb complexes hidden beneath planetary surfaces, often directly below Imperial cities or bases. The Imperium adopted a policy of exterminatus when Necron presence was confirmed on a world, reasoning that the sacrifice of a planet was preferable to allowing the mechanical horrors time to fully awaken their installations. Yet even this extreme measure often proved futile, as Necron tomb complexes were typically buried deep enough to survive orbital bombardment. The only truly effective strategy involved locating and destroying a tomb world's command node. Its controlling intelligence before the majority of its forces could activate. Such precision strikes required intelligence that was rarely available and special forces that were perpetually overextended. More enigmatic but no less dangerous were the Eldari, both the craft world variety that traveled the galaxy in planet-sized vessels of psychically active wraithbone and their darker kin who raided from the webway. Once the dominant species of the galaxy, their civilization had collapsed in a cataclysm of their own making. Their unrestrained hedonism literally birthing a chaos god, Slaanesh, the prince of excess who consumed the majority of their species and their empire in a single catastrophic moment. The surviving craftworlders were a dying race. Each individual loss irreplaceable due to their low reproduction rate and the threat of Slaanesh consuming their souls upon death. This demographic reality shaped their strategy. They would sacrifice millions of humans without hesitation to preserve a handful of their own kind. Their farcers used psychic divination to foresee threats to their craft world centuries in advance, manipulating other species into serving as unwitting shields or weapons against those threats. Imperial commanders learned to dread Eldari involvement in any conflict. Their presence inevitably signaled layers of hidden purpose beyond apparent objectives. A raid that seemed targeted at Imperial resource stockpiles might actually be designed to draw defenders away from a location where centuries later some cosmic alignment would open a warp rift. Other times, Eldari forces would inexplicably aid Imperial campaigns only for the true purpose, perhaps the elimination of some specific individual who threatened a distant craft world to remain forever obscure. Their dark kin were more straightforward in their malevolence, if no less dangerous. The Drukhari, or Dark Elder in Low Gothic, emerged from the hidden city of Camarag within the webway to conduct raids on real space. Their purpose was simple: the capture of living beings whose suffering would sustain the raiders' immortality. What happened to those captives within Camarag's torture chambers was censored from all but the highest-level inquisitorial records, deemed too damaging to morale should the knowledge become widespread. Against these Xenos threats, the armies of the Imperium fought with desperation born of knowing there could be no compromise, no coexistence. Humanity had claimed the galaxy as its birthright during the Great Crusade, and 10,000 years of dogma had calcified this belief into religious certainty. The Emperor had declared that mankind could tolerate no competitors for the stars. The ecclesiarchy had transformed this strategic doctrine into divine mandate. To suggest cooperation with aliens was not merely treason, but heresy punishable by death. Yet the most dangerous enemies facing the Imperium were neither Xenos nor human, but something that defied such categorization entirely. The forces of chaos, demonic entities from the warp and their mortal servants, represented corruption on a spiritual level that could never be truly defeated, only temporarily contained. The universe itself seemed structured to ensure chaos could not be eliminated, as it drew power from the very emotions and thoughts of sentient beings throughout the galaxy. The fallen space marine legions remained the most potent mortal servants of the dark gods. Though 10 millennia had passed since their betrayal, the original traitor marines from the heresy era still lived, sustained by the time-distorting effects of the Eye of Terror and the preservative influence of chaos itself. Unlike their loyalist counterparts, they had not been bound by the Codex restrictions and maintained Legion-scale forces, albeit fragmented into warb bands following competing champions. Abdon the Despoiler, once first captain of the Lunar Wolves and now War Arm Master of Chaos, launched his 13th Black Crusade in 999. M41, the culmination of planning that had stretched across thousands of years. Previous Black Crusades had appeared to Imperial strategists as massive, but ultimately contained raids. Only too late did they realize each had been precisely targeted to achieve specific objectives. The recovery of ancient artifacts, the destruction of particular fortifications, the corruption of key individuals, all in service to the final campaign. The 13th Black Crusade began with simultaneous uprisings on 100 worlds throughout Segmentum Obscurus. As Imperial forces responded to these revolts, Chaos Fleet elements emerged from the Eye of Terror, bypassing the Cadian Gate through warp routes previously unknown to Imperial navigators. By the time the true scale of the invasion became apparent, Abdon's forces had established footholds across multiple sectors, drawing Imperial defenders into a war of attrition they could not sustain. The fall of Cadia marked the campaign's turning point. For 10,000 years, the fortress world had stood as the keystone of Imperial defenses against the Eye of Terror. Its overlapping void shields and surfacito orbit weapon batteries turning back countless chaotic incursions. Its population bred for warfare. Trained from birth in defensive operations and supported by multiple Space Marine chapters on permanent rotation. Cadia represented the Imperium's most formidable military installation outside the Sol system itself. Abaddon's victory came not through conventional superiority, but through apocalyptic decisiveness. When it became clear that Cadian defenders might actually repel the ground invasion, the Despoiler directed the remains of a Blackstone fortress, an ancient alien space station whose weapon systems defied Imperial comprehension, into a collision course with the planet. The impact shattered Cadia's structural integrity, breaking the world apart and opening a direct path for Chaos fleets to penetrate deeper into Imperial territory. More devastating still was the psychic shockwave that followed. The destruction of Cadia, a linchpin in the ancient network of Necron-built pylon systems that had helped maintain the barriers between real space and the warp, triggered a cascading collapse of reality across the galaxy. The Great Rift opened a vast tear in the fabric of Spaceme that stretched from the Eye of Terror to the eastern fringe, effectively cutting the Imperium in half. Planets throughout the path of this Psychitrix Maledictum experienced reality warping phenomena beyond nightmare. Some vanished entirely into the warp. Others found their populations transformed into mutants or vessels for demonic possession within hours. Still others discovered time flowing at altered rates, decades passing in what seemed like days to outside observers, or a single night stretching into subjective centuries for the trapped inhabitants. The regions caught on the far side of the rift from Terror became known as the Imperium Nihilus, the Dark Imperium. Cut off from the Astronomican guidance with astropathic communications reduced to incoherent whispers, these territories faced isolation comparable to the Age of Strife. Systems that had been cornerstones of Imperial power, for millennia collapsed into anarchy within weeks. Entire sectors fell to Xenos invasions or internal rebellion with no hope of reinforcement. Even those worlds that maintained their imperial allegiance found themselves forced into desperate measures for survival. Governors who had once tithed resources to the wider Imperium now hoarded every scrap of food and ammunition. Space Marine chapters abandoned their traditional roles as mobile strike forces, instead establishing permanent defensive perimeters around key worlds. Navigator houses that had once served as neutral carriers of information and transport now leveraged their unique abilities to establish themselves as de facto rulers of isolated regions. On the Terror side of the rift, conditions were marginally better, but still catastrophic by historical standards. The increased warp turbulence made all astropathic communication unreliable and extended travel times exponentially. Reinforcements that might once have reached threatened worlds in weeks now took years, if they arrived at all. The Inquisition, stretched beyond capacity, resorted to increasingly draconian measures, condemning entire populations on the merest suspicion of corruption rather than risk allowing chaos influence to spread. Yet amid this darkness, the Adeptus Est Artis continued to stand as humanity's defenders. On 1,000 worlds, Space Marine chapters fought desperate last stands against overwhelming forces. Many fell in battle, their fortress monasteries overrun, their relics seized by exultant enemies. Others survived through strategic withdrawals, preserving their genetic legacy and combat effectiveness at the cost of worlds they had sworn to protect. Pragmatic decisions that nonetheless weighed heavily on transhuman consciences designed to know no fear but intimately acquainted with failure. The Blood Angels and their successors faced a unique crisis during this period. The death of Sanguinius during the Horus Heresy had left a psychic wound in their gene seed that manifested as the Red Thirst, a craving for blood that could drive even the most disciplined battle brother to feral savagery, and the Black Rage in which warriors experienced their Primarch's final moments of betrayal and death, losing themselves to madness. As the Great Rift spread its influence, these genetic curses intensified beyond all previous experience. On Baal, ancestral home of the Blood Angels, Chapter Master Dante prepared for what he believed would be his final battle. Hive Fleet Leviathan, having altered its course specifically to consume this symbolically important world, surrounded the system with organism ships beyond counting. Simultaneously, a legion of demons manifested on Baal's moons, drawn by the psychic emanations of blood angels consumed by the Black Rage. Caught between biological and spiritual predators, Dante deployed his limited forces with the fatalistic precision of a commander who expects defeat but remains determined to extract the highest possible cost from his enemies. The devastation of Baal, as the campaign came to be known, should have ended with the planet's consumption by tyrannid forces. That it did not was due to the most unexpected development in 10 millennia of Imperial history. The return of a loyal Primarch. Robert Gil Lyman, physically preserved in stasis since his wounding by the traitor Fulgrim, had been revived through the combined efforts of Arch Muggos, Belisarius Cawl, and the Aldari faction known as the Inari. The technological expertise of the former and the reality-bending psychic abilities of the latter had accomplished what most Imperial authorities would have considered impossible or heretical. Gilman's return sent shock waves through the Imperium's political and military hierarchies. Here was a living link to the Emperor himself, a being who had known the Master of Mankind personally and carried his direct authority. The High Lords of Terror, accustomed to ruling by committee for thousands of years, found themselves supplanted by a single individual whose tactical genius and strategic vision had been sharpened rather than dulled by his long absence. The Adeptus Estates, particularly the Ultramarines and their successors, received his return as vindication of 10 millennia of faith that their Primarch would return in the Imperium's darkest hour. Not all welcomed Guilliman's leadership. The Ecclesi particular found itself in a theological quandary. Here stood a son of the God Emperor who had known him before his ascension to divinity, who had participated in the secular Great Crusade and visibly struggled with the religious veneration now accorded to his father. Certain conservative factions whispered that this could not be the true Gilman, but some warp-spawned simulacrum designed to undermine imperial faith. Others, recognizing his authenticity, feared the reforms he might implement if allowed unfettered authority. The Primarch himself had little time for such political considerations. Upon his revival and assessment of the Imperium's condition, he declared the formation of the Indomitus Crusade, the largest coordinated imperial military campaign since the Great Crusade itself. Its purpose, to push back the tide of enemies closing in from all sides, and relieve the most desperately threatened regions of imperial space, particularly the Dark Imperium beyond the Great Rift. Central to this crusade were the Premies Space Marines, a new generation of Adeptuses developed in secret by Belisarius Cawl over 10 millennia. Based on the Primarch's genetic template, but enhanced beyond traditional Space Marines through additional gene seed organs and more stable implementation processes, these warriors represented the first true technological advancement in Imperial military capability for thousands of years. Organized into wholly new chapters like the Sons of the Phoenix and Void Trident, while also providing reinforcements to depleted existing chapters, the Primaris Marines gave the Imperium a fighting chance where none had existed before. The Indomitus Crusade fought across a 100 war zones simultaneously, prioritizing strategically vital worlds and symbolic victories that might restore morale throughout the wider Imperium. On Baal, Gilman's forces arrived just as the Tyranids were on the verge of final victory, driving back the Xenos and securing the Blood Angel's ancestral home. On Thalamor, they broke a demonic siege that had trapped millions of Imperial citizens in a timed, dilated bubble of suffering. On Rallos, they shattered a combined force of Iron Warriors and Night Lords that had established a stranglehold on crucial warp routes. Yet even a Primarch's brilliance and the transhuman might of the Primaris Marines could not reverse the Imperium's overall strategic position. For every world reclaimed, a dozen others fell. For every enemy commander slain, 3 more emerged from the shadows. The Great Rift remained open, a wound in reality that could not be sutured by conventional means. The Tyranids continued their inexorable approach from intergalactic space. The Necrons awakened in ever greater numbers. The followers of Chaos, invigorated by their greatest victory in 10 millennia, pressed their advantage on 10,000 fronts. What Gilman provided was not salvation, but a stay of execution. A chance for the Imperium to reorganize, to adapt, to find some path forward that did not end in humanity's extinction or enslavement. Whether this opportunity would be seized or squandered remained uncertain. The institutional inertia of 10,000 years could not be overcome quickly, even by a Primarch. The religious dogma that had calcified around the Emperor's legacy served as both the Imperium's greatest source of unity and its most significant obstacle to necessary change. In this galaxy of endless war, where defeat meant annihilation, and victory merely survival until the next crisis, the human species continued its desperate struggle. Imperial citizens born into this nightmare knew nothing else, had no concept of peace as anything but a theoretical construct. No expectation of security beyond the temporary absence of immediate threat. Their lives were nasty, brutish, and short, spent in service to an empire that regarded them as utterly disposable. Yet they persisted. In hive cities choked with pollution, they labored at manufacturums producing weapons they would never wield. In agri-worlds stripped of all biodiversity, they tended monoculture crops destined for frontline ration packs. In scholar facilities across the galaxy, they studied tactics and doctrines, preparing to command troops in conflicts where their own lives were measured in hours from deployment. In shrine worlds covered in cathedrals, they prayed to the God Emperor for deliverance. Their faith, perhaps the only truly renewable resource the Imperium possessed in unlimited supply. This was the Imperium of Man in the dying days of the 41st millennium. Not the enlightened federation the Emperor had envisioned, but a despotic theocracy holding the line against extinction through sheer stubborn determination. Its methods were cruel, its doctrines contradictory, its leadership often corrupt or incompetent. Yet it endured because the alternative was worse. The reduction of humanity to biomass for Tyranid consumption, raw material for Necron experimentation, playthings for chaos corruption, or simply cosmic irrelevance as more vital species claimed the galaxy. The war would never end. Victory in any meaningful sense was impossible. The best humanity could hope for was continued existence, the perpetuation of the species, even as individuals died by the billions in conflicts whose strategic purposes they could never comprehend. This was not heroism as ancient mythologies had defined it, but a darker, more desperate form of courage. The willingness to die without glory, without recognition, without purpose, beyond buying another day for a civilization that had forgotten why it began fighting in the first place. In the grim darkness of the far future, there was only war. And mankind, having forgotten any alternative, fought on. Time moves differently within the Emperor's presence. The Adeptus Custodes who stand eternal vigil within the Sanctum Imperialis perceive decades as moments, centuries as hours. Their vigilance never wavers, their attention never dulls. Yet even they cannot say with certainty whether their master still lives in any meaningful sense, or if the withered corpse upon the golden throne remains animated solely by technological artifice and the daily sacrifice of 1,000 psychers. As the 41st millennium drew to its inevitable close, the rate of the Emperor's physical deterioration accelerated beyond the Mechanicus' ability to compensate. The golden throne, that ancient mechanism of forgotten origin, never intended to sustain a mortally wounded demigod for 10,000 years, exhibited failures that the most skilled tech priests could neither fully understand nor repair. Entire Forge worlds devoted their production to manufacturing replacement components based on fragmented templates. Most failed. Those that succeeded provided temporary solutions at best. Palliative care for a machine system as incomprehensible to its current caretakers as the being it sustained. The immense psychic burden of maintaining the Astronomicon, that vital navigational beacon that made warp travel possible across the Imperium, grew more taxing with each passing year. Where once 1,000 psychers had been sufficient daily sacrifice to power this cosmic lighthouse, by late M41, the black ships delivered 10,000 daily to the Emperor's table. Some Imperial philosophers speaking in carefully coded metaphors to avoid accusations of heresy suggested that the Emperor's presence in the warp had become so substantial that it was changing the immaterium itself, creating new tides and currents that required ever greater psychic energy to overcome. Others whispered more disturbing theories. Perhaps the Dark Gods, ascendant since the opening of the Great Rift, were directly contesting the Emperor's psychic dominance. Perhaps the increasing prevalence of psychers among the human population, a trend noted with alarm by the Inquisition's Ordo Hereticus, indicated some imminent evolutionary leap similar to the one that had doomed the Eldery. Perhaps most terribly, the Emperor himself was changing. His fragmentary consciousness evolving into something that no longer prioritized humanity's survival in the same way. These philosophical debates found no audience among the High Lords of Terror. The rulers of mankind concerned themselves with more immediate crises. The impossibility of maintaining military cohesion across a galaxy bisected by the Great Rift. The logistical nightmare of sustaining supply chains through regions where time and space had become unreliable concepts. The increasing frequency with which entire sectors fell silent, their fate unknown until years or decades later when exploration fleets discovered only ruins. The loss of Cadia represented more than the destruction of a strategically vital fortress world. It marked the collapse of a defensive system 10,000 years in the making. A network of overlapping void shields, detection arrays, and rapid response forces that had contained chaos incursions since the heresy. Without this keystone, the entire Cadian Gate, the relatively stable region of space abutting the Eye of Terror, fell into disorder. Warp routes that had been perilous but navigable became impossible maelstrom. Monitoring stations that had provided early warning of chaos fleet movements went dark. Their crews either dead or worse, transformed into vessels for entities that mimicked human communication to lure unwary rescuers. The Great Rift itself defied conventional crafty. Imperial astroctographers attempting to map its boundaries discovered that its edges shifted not merely in physical space, but in time as well. Explorator fleets dispatched into regions adjacent to the rift sometimes returned centuries before they departed. Their crews aged decades during what they experienced as months of travel. Others never returned at all, though their distress signals would be received by planets that would not be settled until centuries later. The very concept of simultaneity of events occurring in a determinable sequence broke down in proximity to this galaxy-spanning wound in reality. This chronological instability particularly affected astropathic communication, already disrupted by the increased warp turbulence. Messages from besieged worlds arrived years after they were sent. Their pleas for reinforcement reaching Terror long after their populations had been enslaved, consumed, or converted to purposes too horrific for official records to acknowledge. Other communications arrived before the events they described, creating paradoxical situations where Imperial commanders received orders referring to battles they had not yet fought or casualties they had not yet suffered. Beyond the Great Rift, in what came to be known as Imperium Nihilus, conditions deteriorated toward anarchy. Cut off from the Astronomicon's guidance, Navy vessels could attempt only the shortest warp jumps, feeling their way from system to system like blind men in an unfamiliar room. Planetary governors, receiving no instructions or tithes demands from sector authorities, reverted to independent rule. Some maintained imperial traditions out of habit or genuine faith. Others quickly devolved into tyrants, cult leaders, or figureheads for Xenos influence. The Space Marine chapters caught in Imperium Nihilus faced the most agonizing choices. Their sworn duty to the Emperor demanded they defend humanity wherever threatened. Yet strategic reality dictated concentration of forces rather than dispersion. Some, like the Flesh Terrorists, abandoned their traditional territories entirely, falling back to defensible core worlds where they might preserve their gene seed and combat effectiveness. Others, like the Nova Marines, fragmented into squad-sized units, distributed across dozens of systems, fighting desperate guerrilla campaigns with no hope of reinforcement or extraction. Most emblematic of the Imperium's desperate circumstances was the fate of the Celestial Lions. This proud chapter, already decimated by the political machinations of an inquisitor they had dared criticize, found themselves isolated on the Shrine World, Elysium 9. Cut off from their fortress monastery, their supplies dwindling, they nonetheless maintained their defensive perimeter against a chaos war band for 3 years. Imperial historians record that the last 12 battle brothers died in perfect formation around the Panlice, world's primary cathedral. Their ammunition exhausted, fighting with combat knives against a horde that outnumbered them thousands to one. Such last stands occurred daily across the Imperium as the time of ending progressed. On Meon, the Iron Guard Regiment held their parade grounds against chaos-corrupted PDF forces for 36 hours, maintaining perfect drill formations even as artillery reduced their numbers from thousands to dozens. On Necro-Andanda, the entire noble house sacrificed themselves to detonate a reactor rather than allow gene-steal cultists to claim their hive spire. On Vestroia, the last surviving Firstborn Regiment marched into the teeth of a traitor Titan Legion, each soldier carrying a melter bomb strapped to their chest, knowing that if even one reached their target, their sacrifice would have meaning. These acts of desperate heroism stood in stark contrast to the increasingly draconian measures implemented by imperial authorities. The Inquisition, overwhelmed by the sheer volume of heretical and xenos threats emerging simultaneously, adopted a policy of preemptive action against populations deemed at statistical risk of corruption. Entire worlds were subjected to exterminatus, not because evidence of taint had been found, but because their proximity to warp phenomena or their history of political instability suggested they might become compromised in the future. The Adeptus Minisum, seeking to maintain public morale through increasingly apocalyptic times, intensified its rhetoric of martyrdom and sacrifice. Imperial citizens were told not merely that dying for the Emperor was their duty, but that suffering itself was divine purpose. That through pain they participated directly in the God Emperor's own eternal agony upon the Golden Throne. Self-flagellation became incorporated into standard worship services. Pilgrimages designed to maximize hardship and physical danger attracted billions of participants, many of whom welcomed death as the ultimate expression of devotion. The Adeptus Mechanicus pursued technological solutions with increasing desperation and decreasing adherence to traditional dogma. Arch-Maros Belisarius Call, already considered radical for his role in creating the Primaris Space Marines, crossed further doctrinal boundaries by incorporating Xenos technology into new weapon designs. Other tech priests, witnessing the deterioration of the Golden Throne, quietly initiated research programs investigating alternative means of sustaining the Emperor's life functions, programs that involved experimentation with warp entities under carefully controlled conditions, blurring the line between technology and sorcery in ways that would have been unthinkable in earlier eras. These institutional adaptations, however radical by historical standards, proved insufficient against the tide of threats rising from all quarters of the galaxy. The awakening of the Necron dynasties accelerated with tomb worlds previously thought dormant or destroyed, revealing vast armies that had simply been hidden in dimensional pocket realms beyond imperial detection. The Phoenix Courts of the Silent King united dozens of previously competing Necron factions under the leadership of Sarek, the last of the Triarch and architect of the species' ancient Biot Transansference. With unified purpose for the first time in millions of years, the Necrons began systematic reclamation of worlds they considered rightfully theirs since before humanity's ancestors had mastered fire. Particularly devastating was their deployment of celestial Ares, planet-sized mechanical constructs capable of inducing targeted solar flares, asteroid impacts, or gravitational anomalies across entire sectors. Imperial worlds found their primary stars suddenly aging centuries within days, or their orbits destabilized by the manipulation of fundamental cosmic forces. The Imperium, accustomed to enemies that could be engaged directly with bolt and blade, found itself facing a species that could wage war by rewriting the laws of physics in localized areas. While the Necrons represented ancient history, reasserting its claim upon the galaxy, the Tyranids embodied a future in which organic life served only as raw material for endless consumption. The hive fleets designated Behemoth, Kraken, and Leviathan had proven to be mere tendrils of a far larger extragalactic presence scout forces testing the galaxy's defenses. The arrival of Hive Fleet Kronos, specialized in combating warp entities through a shadow in the warp so intense that it cancelled out chaos manifestations entirely, demonstrated the Tyrannid's ability to adapt not merely to physical threats, but to metaphysical ones as well. More concerning still were reports of hybridization between different hive fleet strains. Specimens recovered from battlefields where multiple Tyrannid forces had converged showed genetic structures incorporating the most effective adaptations from each parent fleet, creating composite organisms more dangerous than either original strain. The Death Watch, specialists in xenocide, found their carefully catalogued tactics for specific Tyrannid bioforms suddenly rendered obsolete as the creatures incorporated unfamiliar attack patterns or defensive adaptations. The Ordo Xenos estimated that the Tyrannid presence observed within the galaxy represented less than 0.1% of their total biomass based on gravimetric readings from the intergalactic void. If true, and if the Great Devourer maintained its current rate of advance, models predicted the complete consumption of all organic material in the Milky Way within approximately 5,000 years, assuming no other existential threat eliminated humanity first. The forces of chaos, ascendant since the formation of the Great Rift, pursued their own incomprehensible agendas across the galaxy. No longer confined primarily to the Eye of Terror and similar warp storm regions, the traitor legions established footholds on thousands of worlds, corrupting planetary governments, or simply slaughtering existing populations to make way for cultist settlements. The Death Guard transformed once verdant agri-worlds into festering gardens of supernatural disease. The Thousand Suns established sorceresmies on former shrine worlds, conducting mass forced indoctrination of psychically gifted citizens. The Wordbearers raised cathedrals to the dark gods atop the ruins of ecclesiarchy temples, performing rituals that transformed faithful imperial citizens into possessed abominations. Most active were the Black Legion, still led by Abdon the Despoiler after 10,000 years of unrelenting hatred. Unlike the other traitor legions, whose actions served the specific desires of their patron chaos gods, Abdon maintained a strategic focus on the ultimate destruction of the Imperium itself. His forces targeted militarily significant worlds rather than those offering symbolic or psychic value, systematically eliminating defensive strongpoints and supply centers that might support Imperial counteroffensives. Astropathic communications containing his personal signature, a psychic imprint of such concentrated malice that many recipients were driven insane by exposure, arrived in Imperial command centers across the galaxy, each containing the same 7 words. This time, there will be no failure. Against this constellation of threats, the return of Robert Guillamon offered a thin thread of hope, not of victory, which remained impossible by any conventional definition, but of survival measured in centuries rather than decades. The Primarch's strategic genius, enhanced by his unique perspective as both architect of the original Imperial administrative systems and an outsider to their current degraded forms, allowed him to identify inefficiencies and vulnerabilities that had become invisible to those raised within the Imperium's stagnant culture. His indomitous crusade, strengthened by the introduction of Premies Space Marines, achieved tactical victories that would have been impossible before his return. Vital Forge worlds were reclaimed from Mechanicus Hereticus factions. Shrine worlds of irreplaceable cultural significance were cleansed of chaos taint. Defensive perimeters were established around the most strategically critical systems, creating zones of relative stability amid the galactic chaos. Yet even a Primarch could not reverse 10,000 years of institutional calcification overnight. The High Lords of Terror, while publicly acknowledging Guillamon's authority as the Emperor's genetic son and designated regent, worked to undermine reforms that threatened their individual power bases. The Adeptus Mentorum quietly spread suspicion about a leader who had known the Emperor before his apotheosis as the god of mankind and who visibly struggled with the religious veneration his father now received. Inquisition, theoretically outside the standard imperial command structure, selectively interpreted or obstructed Guillimon's directives when they conflicted with inquisitorial doctrine. Most significantly, the Primarch himself recognized that even with his tactical brilliance and the transhuman warriors at his disposal, the Imperium faced too many simultaneous existential threats to overcome through conventional military action. The Great Rift could not be closed by force of arms. The Tyrannid hive fleets could not be permanently defeated, only temporarily delayed. The Necrons could not be destroyed completely when their most critical systems lay hidden in dimensions beyond Imperial detection. And chaos, drawing power from the emotions and thoughts of sentient beings throughout the galaxy, could never be truly eliminated while consciousness itself existed. This recognition led Guillamon to pursue unconventional strategies anathema to traditional Imperial doctrine. He authorized limited cooperation with certain Aldari factions, particularly the Inari, whose assistance had been instrumental in his own resurrection. He dedicated resources to investigating the Necron's anti-warp technology, seeking adaptations that might help stabilize regions adjacent to the Great Rift. Most controversially, he established communication protocols with the Toe Empire, judging that this expanding Xenos Confederation represented a lesser threat than the immediate existential dangers facing both species. These pragmatic compromises earned him powerful enemies within the Imperium's hierarchy. Traditionalist factions pointed to such actions as evidence that the being claiming to be Helaman might actually be some warp-spawned imposter, or that his centuries in stasis had somehow corrupted his loyalty to pure Imperial doctrine. Others, recognizing his legitimacy nonetheless, argued that compromise with Xenos, no matter how strategically justified, represented a dangerous precedent that could undermine the xenophobic foundation of Imperial unity. Guilliman himself showed little concern for these political machinations. His personal writings from this period, preserved in heavily redacted form within the Librarium Imperialis, reveal a being increasingly convinced that the Imperium, as currently constituted, could not survive, and that his role was not to preserve it indefinitely, but to create conditions under which some fragment of human civilization might continue after its inevitable collapse. The Primarch's apparent obsession with establishing self-sufficient fortress systems capable of operating independently of wider Imperial infrastructure suggests he was preparing for a future in which the Astronomicon failed and interstellar travel became impossible. This pessimistic strategic assessment gained credence as the 41st millennium approached its final days. The rate of psycho-births among human populations reached unprecedented levels, with some worlds reporting that 1 child in every 1,000 now manifested psychic abilities, a 1,000-fold increase from historical norms. The black ships of the Adeptus Astra Telepathica, already inadequate to collect the previous tithe of psychic individuals for processing on Terror, found themselves completely overwhelmed by the sudden population explosion of the warp-gifted. Simultaneously, void ship crews throughout the Imperium reported increasing difficulty navigating the warp, even in regions far from the Great Rift. The gellifields that protected vessels from immaterial predators during transit required more frequent reconsecration and failed more often despite these precautions. Ships emerged from the warp, bearing chronometric discrepancies, orders of magnitude greater than historical norms, weeks of subjective time, translating to decades of real space duration, or vice versa. Some vessels reported encountering the psychic residue of ships that had not yet been constructed or would not make that particular journey for centuries. Most disturbing were the reports from navigator houses of a change in the fundamental character of the Astronomicon itself. The psychic beacon that had guided Imperial ships for 10 millennia, always perceived as a pure golden light emanating from Terror, now appeared shot through with threads of darkness. Some navigators described these intrusions as resembling cracks in glass. Others used more disturbing metaphors. Veins in rotting meat. Corruption spreading through pure tissue. Maggots writhing beneath the surface of once untainted flesh. Whether these phenomena represented actual degradation in the Emperor's psychic projection or perceptual distortions caused by the increased warp turbulence remains a matter of theological debate among the few Imperial authorities cleared to acknowledge such reports exist. What cannot be disputed is their practical impact. Increasingly unreliable warp travel, further isolating Imperial worlds from central authority and from each other. Systems that had once received annual supply shipments found themselves cut off for decades. Crusade fleets dispatched to liberate besieged worlds arrived centuries after those planets had fallen, or in some cases before they had come under attack in the first place. The breakdown of reliable interstellar travel and communication accelerated the Imperium's regression toward feudal conditions. Planetary governors, unable to receive consistent instructions from sector authorities, ruled according to local tradition or personal inclination. Imperial Guard regiments stranded far from their home worlds with no prospect of rotation or resupply established themselves as military dictatorships over civilian populations. Even Space Marine chapters bound by oath and gene seed loyalty to the Emperor on distant Terror found themselves forced to make tactical decisions without strategic guidance, effectively becoming independent political entities rather than components of a unified Imperial military structure. This dissolution of central authority might have led to complete collapse were it not for the religious devotion that permeated every level of Imperial society. The Ecclesiarchy's millennia of doctrinal conditioning ensured that even isolated human worlds maintained faith in the God Emperor and by extension theoretical allegiance to his Imperium. Local interpretations varied wildly from the relatively benign imperial cult variant practiced in Ultramar, which emphasized civic duty and collective welfare, to the horrific redemptionist extremes found on penitent worlds where self-mutilation and human sacrifice became standard worship practices. Yet the core identity remained. These were the Emperor's people carrying his light against the encroaching darkness. No matter how distant or abstract his authority had become on Terror itself, the final days of M41 saw increasing psychic phenomena even within the theoretically shielded confines of the Imperial Palace. Adepts working within the Sanctum Imperialis reported hearing whispers in empty corridors, glimpsing movement at the periphery of vision, feeling the weight of unseen presences observing their activities. The Adeptors' Custodes intensified their vigilance, executing any palace staff who reported such experiences on the assumption they represented security risks. Yet the incidents continued, spreading outward from the Golden Throne Chamber in a pattern that suggested something within that sacred space was exerting increasing influence on its surroundings. The Emperor himself, insofar as any being could claim to know his will, showed signs of changing. The tarot readers of the Novice Nobilite, who had interpreted the Emperor's psychic emanations for millennia, reported shifts in the symbolic resonances surrounding his presence. Where once his psychic signature had radiated stoic endurance and sacrificial protection, it now pulsed with more active interventionist energy. Some readings suggested a being preparing for conflict rather than merely enduring it. Others indicated a consciousness reintegrating fragments long separated, becoming more whole, though whether this represented healing or a transformation into something that was no longer recognizably the Emperor of old remained unclear. Most concrete were the changes observed in those Imperial saints and living relics said to channel portions of the Emperor's power directly. The Legion of the Damned Spectral Space Marines, who appeared without warning on battlefields where loyal forces faced annihilation, manifested in greater numbers and with greater physical substantiality than ever recorded. Their traditional fiery aura, once merely decorative, now burned hot enough to ignite materials in their proximity. Their bolters, previously limited to slaying mortal enemies, demonstrated the ability to banish demons permanently rather than merely forcing their temporary retreat to the warp. Similarly, the living saints, individuals in whom the Emperor's power manifested as divine intervention, displayed abilities far beyond their historical parameters. Saint Celestine, perhaps the most famous of these vessels, had once been limited to brief periods of empowerment followed by dormancy or death. Now she maintained her radiance continuously, her wings of pure light visible even to the non-faithful, her sword capable of cleaving through warp entities that had previously shown immunity to physical weapons. New saints emerged across the Imperium, often from the most humble origins, bearing fragments of power that Imperial theologians cautiously suggested might represent the Emperor shedding aspects of himself in preparation for some cosmic metamorphosis. Against this backdrop of psychic transformation and institutional decay, the physical threats to the Imperium continued their relentless advance. The Tyranids pressed inward from multiple vectors, their hive fleets converging toward heavily populated regions with the instinctive precision of predators sensing wounded prey. The Necrons expanded outward from their tomb worlds, their living metal legions immune to fear, exhaustion, or the logistical constraints that hampered Imperial forces. The Orcs, always thriving on conflict, grew stronger as war engulfed the galaxy. Their fungal reproduction accelerating in response to violence, creating a feedback loop of increasing green skin numbers and potency. Most immediately threatening were the forces of chaos, empowered by the Great Rift and the heightened emotional emanations of trillions of humans experiencing unprecedented terror and desperation. Daemon World's planets entirely subsumed into the warp where reality operated according to the whims of their ruling entities proliferated throughout the regions adjacent to the rift. From these strongholds, Chaos forces launched raids deep into Imperial territory, not merely to claim territory or resources, but to conduct mass sacrifices and ritual desecrations that further weakened the barriers between real space and the immaterium. The time of ending had become self-reinforcing. Each Imperial defeat strengthened the forces arrayed against humanity. Each desperate measure implemented by Imperial authorities further hollowed out the institutions they sought to preserve. Each compromising adaptation to immediate threats further eroded the principles upon which the Imperium had been founded. The question was no longer whether the Imperium would fall, but what, if anything, might survive its collapse. Yet within this darkness, pinpricks of light remained not hope, as ancient humans would have understood it, but the stubborn determination of a species that refused extinction. On a million worlds, Imperial citizens continued their daily rituals of devotion, finding meaning in service to a god they had never seen, and an empire that offered them nothing but hardship and premature death. In war zones across the galaxy, Imperial guardsmen faced Xenos, abominations, and demonic entities armed with nothing more than las guns and faith. Knowing their individual deaths were statistically certain, but fighting nonetheless because surrender was unthinkable. The Adeptuses, inheritors of the Emperor's genetic legacy, stood as humanity's final bulwark against the encroaching night. Though their numbers had never been sufficient to defend the Imperium's full extent, their symbolic importance extended far beyond their battlefield effectiveness. In their transhuman forms, ordinary citizens saw the Emperor's design made manifest proof that humanity could be more than its frail flesh. That transcendence remained possible even in an age of regression and decay. When all other hope failed, the knowledge that Space Marines still fought somewhere against the darkness provided sufficient reason for mortal humans to continue their own desperate resistance. Rabbit Gilliman, bearing the full weight of the Emperor's authority, yet acutely aware of his own inadequacy against the tide of threats facing mankind, pushed forward with his reformist agenda, despite institutional opposition and his own growing conviction that he fought merely to extend humanity's twilight rather than to prevent its night. His preemie Space Marines, now integrated into nearly every Loyalist chapter, represented the first successful technological advancement in millennia. Proof that stagnation could be overcome, that adaptation remained possible even within the Imperium's oified culture. As the 42nd millennium dawned, a purely arbitrary chronological marker that nonetheless assumed psychological significance throughout human space, the Imperium stood at its most paradoxical juncture. Never had it faced so many simultaneous existential threats. Never had its institutions been so degraded, its territory so fragmented, its technological base so eroded. Yet never had the psychic presence of the Emperor been more directly felt throughout human space. Never had the faith of ordinary citizens been more fervently expressed. Never had the line between religious devotion and practical desperation been so thoroughly blurred. What this signified remained beyond mortal comprehension. Imperial theologians suggested that mankind approached some final test of worthiness, after which the Emperor would manifest fully to lead his people to victory. More pragmatic analysts pointed to the psychic awakening spreading throughout human populations as evidence of speciation, the emergence of a new Warun form of humanity that might survive where the Imperium itself could not. The most pessimistic observers saw only the final convulsions of a dying empire, the bursts of desperate energy that sometimes animate a corpse immediately after death. The truth, as with all matters concerning the Emperor's will, remained obscured behind layers of metaphor, dogma, and institutional secrecy. What could be stated with certainty was that humanity endured not triumphant, not ascendant, but stubbornly existent despite every cosmic force arrayed against it. The species that had crawled from Terra's primordial oceans, that had weathered ice ages and nuclear devastation, that had claimed the stars as birthright only to lose them and reclaim them again, refused final extinction with the same irrational persistence that had characterized its entire evolutionary history. In the grim darkness of the far future, there was only war. But where there was war, there was still human will, the determination to resist, to persist, to rage against the dying of the light. Whether this represented genuine defiance of cosmic fate or merely the illusion of agency in a universe governed by forces beyond comprehension, the struggle itself provided sufficient meaning for those engaged in it. Humanity fought on, not because victory was possible, but because surrender was unthinkable. In that stubborn refusal lay whatever thin hope remained for mankind's future among the stars.